Varys had always believed in the realm. Or, more precisely, he had believed in his vision of what the realm ought to be: stable, prosperous, and guided by a monarch capable of gentleness as well as strength. In that grand scheme, the Targaryen restoration, at least as he had once plotted, had been paramount. But so many shifting alliances, so many uncertainties, had made him bide his time, spinning his webs quietly across both Essos and Westeros. He used his little birds to glean secrets from the Great Pyramid in Meereen to the bustling ports in Pentos, forging alliances no one expected and hatching plans known only to him. Many considered Varys a spider, weaving intangible threads in the shadows, but none realized the lengths to which he would go if he saw a chance to restore a rightful line to the throne, especially if that chance offered not one Targaryen but two. He knew Viserys Targaryen was full of arrogance, short-sighted cruelty, and an entitled rage that blistered in him from childhood traumas. Varys, however, remembered that even rotted wood could be carved into something of worth under the right tools. Daenerys had been the kinder one, but more vulnerable. He saw in her a heart that would bleed for the small folk. Viserys, on the other hand, might have been a lost cause, yet Varys believed that under the right circumstances, humility could be forced upon even the proudest man. A Targaryen with dragons could shift the entire landscape of power in Westeros. But what if there were two Targaryens with dragons? A cunning spider could spin a tapestry from that thread that might reshape the Seven Kingdoms forever. In the hush of his private chamber, with only a single candle burning and his spider-like shadows flickering on the walls, Varys recalled the rumors swirling in Essos. Word had reached him long before it reached the Red Keep. Viserys Targaryen, that bitter, pale-haired prince, had traveled too far into the Dothraki Sea. Ensnared by his own pride, he had tried to demand from Khal Drogo what no one demanded of a Khal: instant recognition and the golden crown he believed was his. The fool had nearly condemned himself to a gruesome death. Some said the Khal was prepared to pour molten gold upon Viserys' head and kill him in front of Daenerys. But Varys' informants whispered a different rumor. The spider's subtle hand had intervened at the last moment. Months before the crisis peaked, Varys had carefully made contact with a sellsword company that roamed near Vys Dothrak, and he had paid them handsomely to watch over the Targaryen siblings from afar. They were a discreet band of mercenaries who understood coin could speak louder than blood oaths to the Dothraki. When the moment of Viserys' doom came, a time when all the Khalasar readied to watch the silly princeling die in a humiliating spectacle, the mercenaries had attacked at just the right moment, setting fire to a stretch of tents and causing confusion among the Dothraki. Viserys had tried to run, screaming for his sister to protect him, but Daenerys had watched him, half in horror, half in dismay, from her vantage point among the Khal's retinue. While Khal Drogo's warriors were occupied with the flames, Viserys had been spirited away, gagged, and bound for his own safety. It was hardly the rescue of a gallant hero, but it was enough to keep him breathing. Varys' gold had financed that rescue, and so it was that Viserys Targaryen did not die that fateful day. Now the spider would see if the gamble had been worth the cost. If Viserys could be shaped, if he could be forced to grow into a king worthy of the name, then Daenerys would not be alone in her quest when her dragons hatched. Indeed, if Viserys could learn humility and cunning, perhaps he might be the second head of the dragon, forging an even more unbreakable Targaryen claim to the Iron Throne. The notion made Varys' heart pound with a quiet excitement he had not felt in decades. The Targaryens might indeed rise again, and with two riders to command the flames. The question was, how to ensure Viserys did not destroy everything before it truly began. The company who rescued Viserys transported him east, away from the Dothraki Sea, away from his sister. At the time, Daenerys believed him dead or lost, for Khal Drogo never found Viserys' body. The Khal and his blood riders assumed the foolish prince had simply perished in the chaos. Daenerys, though she felt sorrow, also felt a strange relief. Viserys had been cruel to her for so many years, and she had seen the raw, violent nature of the Dothraki overshadow his rantings. She had begun to realize her own strength without her brother's constant threats. Meanwhile, Viserys languished in a small caravan wagon, guarded by mercenaries who had little respect for him. Over days and weeks, he was forced to understand one simple truth: If not for these killers for hire, he would be dead, and they answered not to him, but to a man in the shadows. If he wanted to survive, he had to heed the instructions passed down to him by a messenger who wore an unassuming cloak and carried the sigil of a black stone spider. At first, Viserys raged within the confines of that wagon. The Dothraki had stolen everything from him, he insisted, including his sister's loyalty. He had grown used to lashing out whenever the real world denied him what he believed was his right. He cursed the Cell's words, threatening them with the might of House Targaryen that would be resurrected someday. But each time he tried to command them, they merely smirked or laughed, telling him that their gold had come from someone else, and that man was their true master. Viserys' illusions of being a rightful king began to crack under the relentless pressure of hunger, thirst, heat, and the unfamiliar sense of absolute helplessness. No longer was he Daenerys' caretaker. No longer could he threaten to leave her to the mercy of strangers if she did not obey him. He was the one at the mercy of strangers now. Varys' next step was crucial. Through his messenger, he fed Viserys carefully worded letters, parcels of advice, and dire warnings. One letter read, "The beggar king must shed his rags if he desires a crown of gold. You stand at a precipice. Turn back to your old ways, and you will die, forgotten and unmourned. The Iron Throne is not for the impatient. Bend, and you may yet learn how to stand tall. Reflect, or remain a beggar." At first, Viserys tore the missive to pieces. But as the days wore on, he remembered the molten gold that had nearly been his fate, and he thought again about the letter's words. He waited, each day, for a new message to arrive. Days turned into weeks, and the caravan traveled to distant lands beyond Vis Dothrak. Eventually, the Cell's words were instructed to bring Viserys to a coastal city, likely Pentos, where he would meet an ally who might further instruct him. It was a long road, but along that journey, something began to happen within the exiled prince. He felt for the first time the terror of true powerlessness. In that fear blossomed the possibility of introspection. Viserys, who had always believed he was the rightful king, began to question why the world seemed so determined to humble him. He had heard half the story of his father's madness, but he had never accepted it. Now, stuck among mercenaries who spoke to him only when they needed to feed him or move him, he had long empty hours to reflect on everything that had happened since the downfall of his house. Meanwhile, Daenerys learned to ride with Khal Drogo's people as the Khal's new Khaleesi. She found a measure of acceptance among the Dothraki that surprised her. The life grew in her belly, her child, the stallion who mounts the world, as the Dothraki prophesied. She discovered a strength she had never known, harnessing the loyalty of certain blood riders who admired her bravery. She discovered the ancient secrets of women's healing and midwifery at the side of the Dash Khaleen. And she discovered a strange spark of magic in herself, or at least a special relationship to the eggs that she had been gifted. The dragon's eggs were always warm to her touch, and they seemed to reflect her mood. Though she believed Viserys was gone, she found, unexpectedly, that she did not long for him as she thought she would. Guilt haunted her, but every day that she learned more about her own hidden strengths, she felt that perhaps she was fated for a destiny that her cruel brother would have never understood. Khal Drogo still harbored resentment for the foolish prince who had dared threaten Daenerys in front of his entire Khalasar. But with Viserys gone, and the child on the way, Drogo was content to shift his focus to conquests and plunder to honor his growing family. Daenerys dreamed of crossing the narrow sea someday, but she was patient. She knew that if she forced Drogo's hand too soon, the Khalasar might break. Better to wait, better to learn the ways of the Dothraki until a storm of blood and fire could be unleashed upon the men who had usurped her father's throne. Yet she had no idea how the realm across the sea was shifting, or how her brother's survival might soon come to light. In Pentos, a lavish manse waited, owned, ostensibly, by Illyrio Mopatis, a merchant prince who had a lifelong web of alliances from Braavos to Volantis. Illyrio, of course, was an old friend of Varys, a co-conspirator in more ways than one. They had once arranged Daenerys' marriage to Khal Drogo, believing that a Dothraki army might help place a Targaryen on the Iron Throne. But the plan had gone astray with Viserys' reckless ways. Now, a new possibility presented itself. With 2 Targaryens still living, there might be a more intricate tapestry to weave. Illyrio was not thrilled to deal with a half-mad, half-starved beggar prince. Yet for the sake of his old friend the spider, he was prepared to do so. Viserys arrived in Pentos under cover of darkness, smuggled in a wooden crate that stank of fish and spice. When the sellswords pried open the box, he tumbled out in rags, hair matted, stubble thick on his cheeks. He looked less like a prince than a beggar who had lost even the memory of wealth. Illyrio greeted him with false warmth, offering honeyed wine and roast duck. Viserys devoured it like an animal, half-crazed with hunger. Afterward, Illyrio presented him with clothes befitting a lesser lord, nothing too ostentatious, but still a step up from the tattered remnants of his Dothraki attire. Viserys accepted them wordlessly. He had learned not to demand what he could not force from others. In this new world, he was reliant upon the generosity of these shadowy benefactors. It was in Illyrio's manse that Viserys received another letter from the spider. This one said, "Even a dragon can be reborn from ashes, but first it must accept that it was burned. Learn humility, and the realm might yet call you your grace. Fail, and you will vanish as dust on the wind." Viserys stared at the words for a long time, feeling anger well in his gut. Yet he had to admit he had nearly been dust on the wind. Something in him, a new fear, or perhaps a sliver of self-awareness, stayed his hand from tearing the parchment. Instead, he folded it carefully, placed it into his cloak pocket, and asked Illyrio for more wine. Illyrio, half grooming and half manipulating him, regaled Viserys with stories of growing unrest in King's Landing. Robert Baratheon's hold on power, though seemingly secure, was starting to crack at the edges. Whispers of the Lannisters' ambitions abounded. Meanwhile, in the north, the Starks were stirring, and rumors spoke of tensions across the realm. If there was ever a time for a Targaryen to return, Illyrio said, it would be soon. But a Targaryen without an army was a beggar king. Viserys, remembering how the Dothraki had essentially spit on his pleas, realized that lesson all too well. His posture sagged as the knowledge of his own helplessness settled in. Illyrio pressed further. "We need the right alliances. We need money, armies, and a measure of subtlety, lest the usurper crush you before you cross the narrow sea." Viserys clenched his teeth and quietly nodded. He wanted to scream that he was the rightful king, that his birthright was stolen, but he realized these men, these hidden hands, already knew that. They did not need his rants. They needed a man who could work with them in secret, not a man who would blow their plans apart with foolish tantrums. Slowly, grudgingly, he swore to listen, to follow their guidance, and to wait. It was the first genuine step on a path different from the one he had taken before. Pride did not vanish overnight, but day by day, it cracked. While Viserys was slowly being molded, Daenerys continued her transformations across the sea in the Dothraki Sea. She embraced the role of Khaleesi with increasing confidence. Though she missed Pentos in a small way, the softness of the pillows, the succulent fruits, she found a new sense of home riding beneath the endless sky. She felt that her child strengthened her from within. She started to win the love of the Khalasar by seeing to their wounds, by learning their language intimately, by sharing in their hardships. Little did she know that across the sea, her brother was being reshaped by dire necessity, forging him in the heat of humiliation. Neither sibling realized they were part of a grander plan orchestrated by a silent spider, who watched from King's Landing with half-lidded eyes, gauging every new ripple in the realms of men. King's Landing, of course, remained a nest of vipers. Cersei Lannister circled Robert's weaknesses like a cat around a drunken mouse, while Littlefinger angled for advantage at every turn. The small council squabbled over finances, the cost of royal feasts, and the potential threat of Targaryen exiles. Robert himself spent his nights in an ale-soaked stupor, haunted by the ghost of Lyanna Stark, that sad romance that had fueled his rebellion. All the while, Varys glided through the Red Keep's hallways with a placid smile, offering helpful rumors and disclaimers, playing the fool if it served him. He let slip just enough misinformation that the court believed Daenerys Targaryen was the last of her line, foolishly married to a savage horselord. No one but Varys suspected that the beggar king had escaped certain death and was gathering his will in Pentos. No one but Varys understood that the game was about to change entirely if that second Targaryen could find a way to both humility and power. At night, when the bells of the city tolled quietly in the distance, Varys wrote letters to Illyrio in code, discussing Viserys' progress and inquiring about any subtle changes in his disposition. Word came back that the princeling was more subdued now, studying histories of the Targaryen reign, learning about the mistakes of the Mad King Aerys II, and the successes of great rulers like Jaehaerys I. For perhaps the first time in his life, Viserys was truly learning who his ancestors were. In the library of Illyrio's manse, he pored over old tomes describing the strategy of Aegon the Conqueror and the wisdom of his sisters Rhaenys and Visenya, who had helped unify the realm with fire and blood but also with laws and a sense of justice. Unbeknownst to Viserys, Illyrio occasionally peered through a hidden door, observing him. He noted how the young man's eyes flickered with both longing and regret. Illyrio reported all these details to Varys. "He is changing, but do not expect him to be gentle. He has rage in him still, yet it might be harnessed." Varys read those words and allowed himself the faintest smile. Rage could be powerful if directed properly. As time passed, Varys arranged for small shipments of valuables to trickle into Illyrio's possession, to be doled out to Viserys at intervals. A ring with the Targaryen sigil, a sword rumored to be forged in Dragonstone, relics that reminded Viserys of who he was. Along with these gifts came more letters. A king must be more than a tyrant. A king must be more than a whining child. Show that you can master your own passions, and men will follow you. Viserys' hands often shook when he read these lines, a potent mix of shame and determination swirling within him. He would find himself pacing the marble floors of Illyrio's courtyard, whispering, "I am the dragon. I am the rightful king." But his voice would quaver, unsure. He wondered if the man behind these letters believed in him or merely sought a puppet. That doubt kept him cautious, if not humble. Months turned into a year, and across the sea, Daenerys Targaryen's life changed irrevocably. Khal Drogo fell to a wound in battle, an infection that spread after a skirmish with a rival Khalasar. Daenerys, desperate to save him, placed her trust in a Magi who claimed to have knowledge of blood magic. The result was a ritual that took Drogo's mind and left him a breathing husk. The Khalasar splintered, many riders abandoning their dying call. Daenerys gave birth to a stillborn child, twisted and deformed, a tragedy that nearly broke her. In the aftermath, she walked into Drogo's funeral pyre, clutching her 3 dragon eggs. When the flames died at dawn, she emerged unburnt, and the eggs had hatched into living dragons. Varys received the word from his agents with a sense of awe he had never allowed himself before. Daenerys Targaryen had awakened a power that had slumbered since the fall of old Valyria. He read the report again and again, scarcely believing. Yet the news seemed undeniable. The silver-haired girl had walked through the flames and birthed dragons into the world. Instantly, Varys understood that everything had changed. He had placed his wagers carefully, but even he had not anticipated this turn of events. If Daenerys now commanded 3 dragons, she held a fearsome key to Westeros that no alliance of lords or merchants could match. The spider moved swiftly, ensuring King's Landing's official reaction was muddled and slow. He whispered that it was likely a myth, a rumor from across the sea. Yet privately, he sent word to Illyrio. The sister has claimed fire incarnate. If the brother is to be worthy at all, now is the time to test him. Hurry. In Pentos, Illyrio came to Viserys in the middle of the night, rousing him from a restless sleep. He told him of Daenerys's dragons. Viserys almost collapsed at the news. Shock, envy, disbelief all warred within him. His sister, the meek child he had threatened so many times, was now the mother of dragons. And he, Viserys, was left behind in Pentos, reliant upon others' kindness for a warm bed. But before despair overwhelmed him, Illyrio took him to a hidden chamber beneath his manse and showed him something that made his breath catch. There, chained and muzzled, was a small creature, no larger than a cat, covered in translucent scales of a pale gold hue. A baby dragon, stolen from a remote corner of the Red Waste. One that had inexplicably hatched near Daenerys' camp but wandered astray or been captured by opportunistic hunters. Illyrio had paid a fortune to spirit it away. Its life hung by a thread, its whimpering breath a faint crackle of flame. Viserys stared at it, a swirl of terror and fascination in his eyes. A real dragon, living and breathing, not just the petrified eggs he had once seen among the Targaryen treasures. Illyrio said quietly, "We dare not keep it here for long. It needs its mother, or else it may perish. But you see now, do you not? The old power is returning to your house. If your sister commands 3 dragons, and you command one, imagine what you can accomplish together." The baby dragon let out a feeble hiss of flame, and Viserys reached out a trembling hand. Fire was supposed to be in his blood, but he felt fear more than any sense of kinship. The creature's presence made him realize how small and fragile he was compared to the legends of old Valyria. He felt tears threatening, though whether they were tears of wonder or jealousy, he did not know. Illyrio gave him a chance to stroke the dragon's head. Its scales were surprisingly warm, and a shiver ran through Viserys' body. Something primal awoke in him, a flicker of awe for the living embodiment of his heritage. Yet the creature was chained, muzzled, at the mercy of men who did not love it. In that moment, the memory of his own captivity with the Dothraki Sellswords came roaring back. Could this be how the dragon felt, caged and powerless? A rush of sympathy flooded him, and he stared at Illyrio. "We must free it," he said abruptly. "We must return it to Daenerys." Illyrio seemed taken aback by the sudden passion in Viserys' voice, but he nodded slowly. "That is precisely the plan, but we must do so carefully." Viserys realized that to do anything carefully, he would need cunning, patience, and alliances. He thought of the letters from the spider, urging him to become more than a beggar. Perhaps this was his chance. He would swallow his pride, approach his sister not as a domineering brother but as an equal, to see if they could stand together as the last Targaryens. But first, he had to earn an invitation into her presence. He had to show the spider and the realm that he was not the same fool who nearly died screaming for a golden crown among the Dothraki. So he bowed his head in a gesture of surprising humility to Illyrio and asked, "What do I need to do?" Illyrio's instructions were complex, but in essence, they boiled down to gathering loyal men, forging alliances, and biding time until a meeting with Daenerys could be arranged. Messengers were sent across the narrow sea to track her movements as she attempted to carve out her own base of power in Slaver's Bay. First to Karth, then to Astapor, Yunkai, and Meereen. Tales of her dragons spread like wildfire, creating both awe and fear. Many claimed the dragons were small but growing faster than anyone imagined. Soldiers who had encountered them spoke of the searing heat they unleashed and the near-human intelligence in their reptilian eyes. While Daenerys struggled to free slaves and build an army of the freed, the scions of power in Essos debated whether to crush her or bargain with her. Viserys could only follow these developments from afar, steeling himself for the moment when he would cross into her orbit. Meanwhile, the baby dragon in Illyrio's possession grew weaker. No matter how carefully Illyrio's men tried to feed it, the creature seemed listless, wanting its mother or the open sky. Viserys would watch it for hours, stroking its head, whispering that soon they would return it to Daenerys. He felt a strange kinship with the young creature, for both of them had been caged, both of them dangerously reliant on the charity of others. Nights found him wide awake, reading histories of the Targaryen conquests, dreaming of what might be. For all his new humility, the old flickers of pride still burned. He pictured himself riding a dragon into King's Landing, the city bowing before him. But now he tempered those visions with a sense of strategy, remembering the lessons of patience gleaned in his captivity. He was no longer the brat who had demanded his crown without forging the alliances needed to secure it. When Varys's next missive arrived, It told Viserys that Daenerys was rumored to be in Meereen. She had taken the great city with the aid of her growing army of unsullied and freedmen. She was setting herself up as a queen of sorts, determined to abolish slavery in Slaver's Bay before she turned her eye to Westeros. The letter continued, "Her path diverges from ours at times. She has a tender heart and a fierce sense of justice. If you mean to stand at her side, you must consider how to unite your strengths, not overshadow hers. Earn her trust, or she will leave you behind as she did in the Dothraki Sea. And your chain-bound dragon's time grows short. Move soon or fail." Viserys read and reread the words until they etched themselves into his mind. Unite your strengths, earn her trust. This was not the talk of a man who believed he had an inherent right to rule. This was the talk of an ally seeking mutual advantage. In that sense, it was an admission that Daenerys was his equal, or perhaps even his superior now with her 3 dragons. But Viserys realized that if he clung to the old illusions, she would spurn him, and the realm would never unite behind a bickering pair of Targaryens. For the first time, he saw that their father's madness and their own torment during exile had fractured their relationship. If they were to succeed, they had to forge a new bond, or accept that only one Targaryen would claim the throne. Thus, Viserys let Illyrio arrange a secret voyage to Meereen. A small ship slipped out of Pentos at night, carrying Viserys, 2 loyal knights from Westeros who had joined his cause, lured by promises of future rewards, and a handful of Pentoshi guards. Hidden in the cargo hold was the baby dragon, chained in a special crate. Viserys spent much of the journey by its side, feeding it scraps, watching the flicker of flame that still burned in its throat. He wondered if it recognized him in any way, if it trusted him. When the weather turned violent and the ship lurched, he whispered calming words to it, as if comforting a frightened child. The crew muttered prayers to the gods, but to Viserys, it felt like a test. The sea was raging, but he would not give up. He might be battered, but if he made it to Meereen, he would stand before his sister not just as a beggar, but as one who came bearing a precious gift. They arrived on the shores near Meereen under cover of a dark night. Word had been passed to Daenerys's closest advisors, likely Barristan Selmy or Missandei, that a visitor claiming Targaryen blood wished to speak with her, bearing news and a gift of great import. The messenger had not revealed Viserys' identity. Unsure if Daenerys would outright reject him upon learning he was the brother who had once threatened her. Yet Daenerys, curious and hearing that this visitor had a wounded dragon in tow, agreed to a discreet meeting in a secure courtyard within Meereen's Great Pyramid. She believed it might be a lost hatchling of one of her own brood. A sense of concern for the creature overcame her wariness, and so she prepared to see this unnamed envoy. By torchlight, flanked by unsullied guards and wearing a simple linen dress, she waited in the courtyard, her dragons perched in the shadows above, sensing her tension. The courtyard gate opened, and Viserys Targaryen stepped through. His silver-gold hair, grown longer and carefully combed, caught the torchlight. He wore plainer clothing than Daenerys remembered him ever choosing, no showy finery, but a subdued black cloak with a silver clasp. Behind him, 2 knights carried a crate, from which odd scraping and faint hissing sounds issued. Daenerys's eyes widened in shock. A dozen emotions flooded her face. Anger, disbelief, sorrow, wariness. She had watched him nearly die. In a sense, she had accepted that he was gone. To see him now, older, changed, standing with measured humility, threw her off balance. Viserys went to one knee. He did not posture as a king, but lowered his head in genuine supplication. The courtyard was silent, save for the soft crackle of torches and the hiss of the dragons perched above. Then Viserys spoke, in a voice that trembled slightly but was laced with sincerity. "Daenerys, your grace, I have come to beg your forgiveness, and to offer you something I hope will show that I am no longer the man you knew." Daenerys's heart pounded. She wanted to lash out at him for the years of cruelty, for the threats, the insults. She wanted to have him dragged away for the hateful words he had spat at her in the past. Yet she could not deny that the man before her seemed different. She motioned for him to rise. Her advisors murmured, uncertain. Daenerys simply said, "Viserys, you live. How?" He briefly recounted his escape, omitting the precise details of Varys's involvement. He spoke of the captivity, the journey, how he had learned of her conquest in Slaver's Bay, and how he had found a lost hatchling. At that mention, the knights gently set the crate down. Daenerys gestured, and two Unsullied stepped forward to open it. The small, gold-scaled dragon inside hissed weakly, eyes half-lidded, its body thin. A gasp escaped Daenerys's lips. She reached out, her hand trembling, letting the dragon sniff her palm. Recognition seemed to flicker in its dim eyes. Carefully, Daenerys lifted it, cradling it to her chest. She glanced up at the black and green dragons perched overhead, and they let out curious growls. The golden hatchling stirred, as though faintly responding to its sibling's presence. Daenerys murmured soothingly in Valyrian, tears forming in her eyes. She had feared she had lost one of her children or that it had been taken. Now here it was, starved and wounded, but alive. Viserys watched the scene, feeling awe at his sister's bond with the creatures. He recalled how he had once threatened to wake the dragon, never dreaming that his sister would be the one to truly do it. In the hush, Daenerys pressed her lips to the little dragon's head, and then looked at Viserys. For a long moment, she said nothing, studying him as if seeking to pierce his soul. Then she spoke softly, "You have done a great thing returning this hatchling to me." "Why?" Viserys swallowed. "I once believed I was the only one who could restore our house. But I see now it is you who has awakened the dragons. I cannot deny that, nor do I want to. I wish to stand beside you, to atone if I can." His voice cracked as he admitted it. "I did terrible things to you in the past, but I have changed, Dany. I beg you to let me prove it, for the sake of our family's name." Daenerys studied his face. She saw lines of hardship there, the haunted look of someone who had known fear and had been broken by it. It was a look she recognized from her own travails after Drogo's death. Gently, she let the baby dragon curl around her arm. Her other dragons, Regal and Viserion, swooped down from their perch, sniffing and chittering as they beheld their missing sibling. Daenerys took a deep breath, remembering the times Viserys had yanked her hair, threatened her, sold her in marriage for an army that never truly materialized. Yet something in her heart stirred with pity, and with the faintest sense of familial connection. "Very well," she said. "You may stay, but know this. If you harm me or my children, if you return to your cruelty, I will not hesitate to burn you. Is that understood?" Viserys nodded, trembling. "Yes, my queen." He said the words without irony or bitterness, shocking those in attendance. Thus began his tentative alliance with Daenerys Targaryen. Over the following weeks, Daenerys allowed him to remain in Meereen under watchful eyes. She saw how he tended the little gold dragon, a creature the Unsullied had taken to calling Orion, after the last High Emperor of Valyria. Viserys struggled to learn Valyrian phrases so he could calm the dragon's anxieties, an act that made Daenerys's heart soften a fraction. She also noticed he never once threatened or berated any of the freedmen or servants, a departure from the bullying ways she remembered. Still, Viserys' acceptance by Daenerys' advisors did not come easily. Ser Barristan Selmy remembered how Aerys too had devolved into madness, how Rhaegar had died tragically, and how Viserys' cruelty to Daenerys in their exile had nearly undone her. He did not trust the young man. Jorah Mormont, though no longer in Daenerys' close confidence due to his past betrayals, still lingered nearby, and he had seen enough to remain wary. Missandei, with her calm insight, observed Viserys from the sidelines, reporting any concerning behavior to Daenerys. But as the moons turned, Viserys did not lash out. He seemed determined to prove himself. He offered suggestions for forging alliances with other Associ cities, citing histories of Valyrian outposts. He recommended a gentler approach to certain Yunkish lords who might otherwise sabotage Daenerys' hold on Meereen. While not all of his ideas were accepted, Daenerys was impressed at his willingness to serve rather than command. Then came the matter of the dragons. Drogon, the largest and fiercest, was already outgrowing the smaller siblings. Rhaegal and Viserion followed their sister's lead, though they were not as big. Orien, the gold hatchling, remained stunted from its time in captivity, but day by day it grew stronger with Daenerys's care and Viserys' gentle feeding. One fateful day, Daenerys stood atop the pyramid with Viserys by her side, all 4 dragons arrayed around them. A hot wind blew in from the desert. She looked at her brother and asked, "Do you think these dragons will accept another rider?" Viserys' heart pounded. He had dreamt of this moment ever since seeing Aegon's conquest depicted in dusty tomes. Yet he held back his excitement. He had learned that arrogance could be his undoing. Slowly, he replied, "They are not horses to be broken. They choose as much as we do. If it allows me, I would be honored to fly beside you, but I will not presume." Daenerys nodded, her violet eyes intent on him. The next day, she arranged a test of sorts. Viserys stood in a training yard, the golden dragon perched on a low stone wall. Daenerys approached, murmuring to Orien in Valyrian. Then she invited Viserys to do the same. At first, the dragon hissed, uncertain. It remembered the chain, the muzzle, but Viserys had never wielded the whip against it. He had been the one to try to soothe it. He knelt, offering a piece of fresh meat, cooing gently in halting Valyrian. Orien cocked its head, exhaled a puff of warm air, and then carefully snapped up the meat. Its golden eyes locked on Viserys, as if weighing some intangible measure of the man. Then, in a swift motion, it spread its wings, hopped onto his shoulder, and let out a sharp cry. Daenerys, watching from a safe distance, felt a thrill spark through her. The bond was forming. It might never be as strong as hers, for she was the mother of dragons, but it was enough to be real. Something ancient and powerful passed between Viserys and Orien in that moment, some silent acceptance. Word spread quickly among the freedmen and the unsullied that another Targaryen seemed capable of communing with the dragons. Though Orien was smaller than its siblings, it would grow. Perhaps more slowly, but it would grow. This sent a ripple of excitement through Meereen's population and a tremor of fear through its enemies. 2 Targaryens with dragons? That was a force the world had not seen in centuries. Some, of course, whispered that Viserys might betray Daenerys as soon as he found a chance. But Daenerys kept him close, determined to watch him carefully. If he truly had changed, then House Targaryen had doubled its draconic might. If he had not, she would end him swiftly. In King's Landing, the news eventually reached Varys's ears, carried by his little birds. He closed his eyes and took a steady breath, feeling both satisfaction and apprehension. Viserys had succeeded beyond Varys's expectations. Now, the Targaryen siblings possessed 4 dragons between them, a terrifying prospect for any who opposed them. Varys knew that the game was about to escalate. Robert Baratheon would scoff and roar about heading off to kill the dragon pups. But in truth, the realm's coffers were emptying, and the Lannisters were weaving their own plots. The arrival of 2 Targaryens, if it came with an army, might be enough to topple the shaky foundation upon which the Baratheon-Lannister alliance stood. All it would take was the right nudge. And so Varys worked tirelessly behind the scenes, encouraging certain lords to question the king's expenditures, nudging others to recall the injustices visited upon them by Tywin Lannister in the past. He let slip rumors that Daenerys had grown a benevolent queen in Meereen, freeing slaves, listening to the pleas of the common folk. The idea that a Targaryen queen might be gentler than the rumored Mad Kings circulated among the restless populace. Even the Iron Islands began to cast about for new opportunities, uncertain of where to place their loyalties. War brewed on the horizon, and Varys was more than willing to stir the pot if it meant the realm might eventually see a stable monarchy. He believed that a reformed Viserys and a tempered Daenerys, supported by dragons, might bring a lasting peace once the dust settled, provided they both learned the skills of ruling. If not, Westeros might burn. Across the sea, Daenerys tested her brother's loyalty in the crucible of war. Rebellious slavers outside Meereen attempted to retake the city with hired mercenaries. Daenerys led a counterstrike, unleashing Drogon's flames on the enemy supply lines. At her side soared Viserys on Orion, though the younger dragon's flames were not as fierce. Still, the effect of two Targaryens leading an aerial assault astonished friend and foe alike. Viserys felt the wind whip through his hair, the intense heat radiating beneath him, and a heady rush of power nearly overwhelmed him. He could have indulged in old fantasies of punishing all those who scorned him, but he glanced over at Daenerys, astride Drogon, her silver-gold hair streaming out behind her, her face resolute yet laced with compassion for the innocents below. In that moment, he understood that a true king or queen must use power for more than personal vengeance. He struggled to restrain Orion's flames from torching the city's outskirts, focusing instead on the armed camps outside the walls. When the day was won, Daenerys privately praised him for showing control. Tears pricked at Viserys' eyes at the unexpected compliment. A seed of pride and gratitude mingled in his chest. He was forging a new identity, one shaped by adversity and guided by the sister he had once mistreated. The confrontation outside Meereen ended swiftly, the enemy crushed. Over the next few weeks, the siblings cemented their hold on Slaver's Bay. Daenerys declared that no one should be enslaved again, that the free folk of the city would be allowed to choose their trades, their leaders. She set up councils of freedmen to govern day-to-day affairs, though she maintained overarching authority as queen. Viserys advised her on the complexities of forging alliances with local nobles, reminding her that some measure of pragmatic politics was necessary to avoid constant uprisings. Daenerys, who had once believed freeing the slaves was enough, began to see the merits of strategic negotiations to ensure stability. Their synergy grew, each offering a different perspective. For the first time since the doom of House Targaryen, a genuine partnership began to form between siblings of the dragon. As time marched on, envoys from Westeros arrived, some from the Martells of Dorne, some from the Tyrells of the Reach, each testing the waters of a possible alliance. They beheld Daenerys and Viserys together and realized that the Targaryen threat was not a single exiled girl with half-trained dragons. It was a nascent dynasty with 2 dragon riders, a massive freedman army, and an iron will. Some envoys recoiled in fear, certain that war would scorch the 7 kingdoms. Others saw opportunity to break free from Lannister or Baratheon influence. Deals were whispered about, trade routes secured. The spider's webs, spun by Varys from across the sea, guided some of these envoys to Meereen's gates, quietly stoking the embers of rebellion. The Targaryen restoration was no longer a mere dream, it was a looming reality. In Meereen, Daenerys took counsel with her brother in a large hall lined with pillars carved to resemble dragons. The constant swirl of freedmen, mercenaries, and foreign dignitaries made the city a melting pot of cultures. Daenerys wore the markings of a queen, silver embroidery on her flowing dresses, a small golden crown inlaid with rubies that matched the color of dragonfire. Viserys, who had always yearned for such an adornment, wore no crown at all for now. He stood at her right in black and red garments, a subtle nod to House Targaryen's colors. In that hall, they debated the next step, crossing the sea or solidifying their rule in Slaver's Bay. Daenerys voiced her desire to free all slaves in the region first, to ensure she left no city in chains behind her. Viserys argued that a prolonged campaign might drain their resources and momentum. Both had valid points, and the debate was fierce. In the end, they compromised. Daenerys would send envoys to the remaining slaver cities, demanding negotiations for the gradual release of slaves under threat of fire and blood. If the slavers refused, she and Viserys would respond with dragons. Meanwhile, they would begin quietly amassing ships to prepare for an eventual crossing of the narrow sea. Their eyes were set on Westeros, but they would not leave Slaver's Bay to fall back into the hands of cruel masters. The seeds of that final confrontation were planted. Shipwrights from Karth and the Summer Isles came to Meereen, lured by Targaryen gold and promises of new trade lines once Daenerys and Viserys conquered Westeros. Over time, a fleet began to grow in Meereen's harbors. At night, the siblings would stand on a high balcony of the pyramid, looking out at the flickering lanterns of the shipyards, listening to the roars of distant dragons as they hunted. In those quiet hours, they sometimes spoke of their family, of Rhaegar, who had fallen on the trident of the Mad King, whose legacy had cast such a long shadow. Viserys would confess his fears that the same madness might lurk in his blood. Daenerys, remembering her own brush with fury when she crucified Myreen's great masters, admitted the same worry. Yet they recognized that together, they might balance each other's extremes if they truly shared power rather than hoarded it. When at last a year had passed since Viserys first arrived in Meereen, the Targaryen forces had swelled to include thousands of Unsullied, tens of thousands of freedmen who had trained with spear and bow, and dozens of ships. More would be built. The slaver cities of Yunkai and Astapor lay in ruin or chaos, uncertain whether to accept Daenerys' demands or muster desperate resistance. Meanwhile, Orien had grown to nearly the size of Regal, though it bore thin scars from its early captivity. The gold dragon was cunning, keen-eyed, and fiercely loyal to Viserys. Drogon, larger than the rest, often challenged Orien in aerial displays, but the smaller dragon refused to back down, spitting jets of flame until Drogon relented. Daenerys watched these displays with interest, finding parallels in her relationship with her brother. They once would have torn each other apart, but now they found a balance, albeit a delicate one. Messengers from Westeros brought troubling news. Robert Baratheon was dead, felled by a boar while hunting. Some claimed it was an accident. Others whispered of Lannister treachery. Now Joffrey Baratheon sat the Iron Throne, though rumors abounded that he was a bastard son of Jaime and Cersei Lannister. The realm teetered on the brink of war, with the North in open rebellion under Robb Stark, the Riverlands ravaged, and the Tyrells at odds with King's Landing. Civil war roiled the Seven Kingdoms. Varys, ever the orchestrator, vanished from court at a critical moment, leaving confusion in his wake. The time was ripe, he whispered in coded messages, for the Targaryens to return, restore order, and claim their rightful seat. 2 dragons, no, 4, would darken the skies of Westeros soon enough. Daenerys and Viserys stood side by side in the Great Pyramid's throne room, where Daenerys often held court. She wore a flowing white gown, her silver crown catching the sunlight. Viserys wore black and red, the Targaryen sigil embroidered over his heart. The freedmen, the unsullied captains, and the foreign emissaries awaited their announcement. Daenerys looked to Viserys, and he inclined his head respectfully, letting her speak first. She drew a deep breath and declared that the time had come to set sail for Westeros. Her voice carried across the hall like a clarion call. The men cheered, the freedmen chanting, "Mysa, Mysa," as they had named her. She raised her hand for silence, then continued, "I go to claim my birthright, to free the people of Westeros from a cruel boy king's rule, and to restore peace and prosperity. I do not go alone." Her gaze shifted to Viserys. "My brother stands beside me, as the second head of the dragon, forging a new dawn for House Targaryen." Viserys stepped forward, swallowing his nerves. He had learned to project calm dignity. "I have wronged my sister in the past, but I have pledged to atone, and she has graciously allowed me to prove myself. Together, we will bring justice to the 7 kingdoms that spurned us. We will not be tyrants. We will be rulers worthy of our ancestors, rulers who defend the small folk as fiercely as we defend our own honor." He paused, letting that message sink in. The crowd, seeing the siblings united, roared its approval. Daenerys glimpsed tears in the eyes of some freedmen who had never imagined they might cross the sea to fight for a queen they loved, or a king they might learn to respect. The next weeks were a flurry of activity as the Targaryen host prepared to depart Meereen. Daenerys entrusted the city to a council of trusted advisors, ensuring that no slavers' chains would return in her absence. Viserys, coordinating the loading of supplies, found himself working alongside unsullied officers and freedmen militia who had once sneered at the notion of him as a leader. Now they saluted him, calling him Prince Viserys, or even King's brother. A new sense of respect grew, tenuous but real. Viserys felt the old arrogance try to stir within him, but he remembered the day he nearly died under Khal Drogo's wrath. He remembered the months spent caged in a wagon, He remembered the baby dragon in chains. Humility tempered his pride, and so he worked diligently, earning more loyalty than he ever had through threats. At last, on a scorching afternoon, the Targaryen fleet set sail. Daenerys stood on the deck of the flagship, her dragons circling overhead. Viserys, aboard another vessel, soared into the sky on Orien, scanning the horizon. All around them stretched the glittering sea, row upon row of sails bearing the three-headed dragon sigil. The newly minted Targaryen navy, funded by the spoils of war in Slaver's Bay and commanded by a mix of seasoned captains and freedmen volunteers, was a sight that made Viserys' heart swell. He saw Daenerys wave from her ship, Drogon swooping past in a graceful arc, and he guided Orien closer, feeling the rush of possibility in every gust of wind. Their crossing was fraught with challenges. Storms, rumors of pirates, the logistics of feeding so many soldiers at sea. But at last, the coast of Dorne appeared on the horizon. The Martells had long nursed a grudge against the Lannisters for Elia Martell's murder during the sack of King's Landing. Word had come that Prince Doran Martell might offer cautious support to the Targaryens, provided certain arrangements were made. Daenerys, remembering the importance of alliances, prepared to treat with the Dornish lords. Viserys accompanied her, mindful of the chance to prove his worth in diplomatic matters. Together, they landed on Dornish shores, their dragons sending a shudder of awe through the population. Doran Martell, a careful and deliberate man, greeted them behind high castle walls. He met Daenerys in private, hearing her pledges to avenge Elaya's death and protect Dornish autonomy. Viserys added his own vow, acknowledging the dark deeds done in King's Landing. The next morning, a small but heartfelt alliance was inked. The Martell banners rose alongside the Targaryen standard. The realm began to shift. More lords in the Stormlands and the Reach remembered the horrors of Joffrey's rule, or had heard of them from travelers. The realm had splintered further since Robert's death, with the War of the Five Kings raging among the Baratheon brothers, the Lannisters, and the North. It was into this chaos that the Targaryen siblings marched. From Dorne, they led a steady advance northward, with Orien and Drogon burning enemy strongholds that refused to parley. Rhaegal and Viserion served as support, each occasionally ridden by Daenerys or left free to harass supply lines. The small folk, hearing rumors of the Targaryens' approach, sometimes fled in terror. But as Daenerys' soldiers passed, they did not pillage or rape. The freedmen who served Daenerys remembered their own suffering and practiced restraint. In some villages, the Targaryen force distributed food or offered healing to the sick, forging a sense that perhaps these conquerors were different from the Lannisters or the other warring factions. Viserys ensured that discipline was enforced among his knights, refusing to allow the old arrogance of conquest. He had been scorned enough to know what fear and powerlessness felt like. At Storm's End, they encountered the forces of Stannis Baratheon, who claimed himself king on the Iron Throne by right of Robert's line. Stannis, a stern man, was unyielding in his claim. But faced with dragons, the advantage was clearly on the Targaryen side. Daenerys offered a parley, explaining she had no desire to massacre thousands. Stannis, proud as any Baratheon, was tempted to fight to the death. Yet the sight of 4 dragons arrayed in the sky, black and red and green and gold, gave even him pause. With no succor from King's Landing, and his own men weary from battles with his brother Renly, Stannis saw his cause was hopeless. In a solemn meeting within Storm's End's Great Hall, Stannis surrendered the castle in exchange for leniency. He refused to bend the knee at first, but Daenerys, with Viserys at her side, convinced him that the realm needed stability, and that they would see to it that justice was done for the crimes of House Lannister. Reluctantly, Stannis bent the knee, though his eyes burned with bitterness. Each victory brought Daenerys and Viserys closer to King's Landing, and closer to the final confrontation with the Lannisters. The capital was in disarray, with Joffrey's sadistic nature alienating many, and the revelation of his incestuous parentage further fueling the fires of rebellion. Tywin Lannister, cunning as ever, tried to rally enough forces to defend the city. But as the Targaryen host marched, joined now by many Storm Lords and even some Reach Lords, the tide turned irreversibly. Ravens flew in every direction, carrying pleas for alliances or offers of surrender. Varys, from his hidden vantage, carefully orchestrated events within the city, ensuring certain gates would be opened to the Targaryens' advantage. On a fateful morning, Daenerys and Viserys found themselves camped before the walls of King's Landing, their dragons perched on the hills behind them, the city trembling with anticipation. In council, Daenerys stated she would offer the city one chance to surrender peacefully. She did not desire a second sacking of King's Landing, remembering the stories of how House Lannister had slaughtered innocents. Viserys agreed, cautioning that while the small folk might yield, the Lannister guard in the Red Keep could still fight ferociously. Hours later, a small group emerged from the city, wearing white flags. Within the gates, chaos raged as Cersei Lannister tried to keep control. The refugees pleaded with the Targaryens, "Don't burn us, we beg you." Daenerys, her heart heavy with memories of slaver cities, promised them mercy if they opened the gates. They did. As Targaryen forces poured into King's Landing, they found scattered resistance from Lannister men-at-arms. But the presence of dragons overhead dissuaded most from fighting. Daenerys rode into the city on Drogon, flanked by Rhaegal and Viserion in the sky, while Viserys took to the air on Orien, scanning for pockets of resistance. When they reached the Red Keep, Cersei stood defiant on the ramparts with Joffrey, who shrieked curses and threats. A volley of arrows soared up, but Orien incinerated them in midair. One final roar from Drogon broke the last of the Lannister defender's spirit. Joffrey, in a panic, tried to flee, only to be seized by his own knights desperate to escape dragonfire. Cersei spat venom at Daenerys when the queen ascended the Red Keep steps. But there was no victory to be had for the Lannisters now. In short order, the city fell, and the throne room was opened. Inside, Daenerys Targaryen approached the Iron Throne she had dreamed of as a child, her dragons roaring in the distance. Viserys walked beside her, each step an echo of the Targaryen legacy. Scores of onlookers, highborn and small folk alike, packed the hall, trembling in fear or hope. Daenerys paused before the twisted swords that made the throne. She saw her reflection in the polished steel, remembering the father she never knew, the illusions that had once guided Viserys. With a steady breath, she turned to the crowd. "I am Daenerys Stormborn of House Targaryen," she said, her voice resonating. "The rightful queen of the Undulls and the First Men. I come not as a tyrant, but as a liberator. Kneel and you shall be spared. Stand with me, and together we will rebuild a realm worth living in." A hush fell as one by one, lords and ladies sank to their knees. Even Cersei, forced by unsullied spears, bowed in sullen fury, her eyes never leaving Daenerys. Viserys, standing at Daenerys' shoulder, watched, heart pounding. He had once believed that seat belonged solely to him. Now he felt only a strange sense of pride that his sister, and by extension their house, had reclaimed it. Daenerys motioned for him to step forward. "This is my brother, Prince Viserys Targaryen, second of my name. He too has a claim to rule, yet he has chosen to stand beside me. Let all the realm see that the Targaryen line is renewed with unity, not division." She looked to Viserys, inviting him to speak. He swallowed, scanning the hall. He saw a swirl of faces. Fear, curiosity, hatred, hope. At last he spoke. "House Targaryen once fell through madness and betrayal. We have returned not to repeat our ancestors' sins, but to restore order and justice." He felt a tremor in his voice but pushed on. "I was once unworthy of my name, but I have learned humility through hardship. I stand by my sister as she takes the throne our family forged, and I swear I will protect the realm and all its peoples until my dying breath." Silence lingered for a moment, then a roar of assent filled the chamber. The small folk, desperate for new leadership after years of strife, cheered. Some lords, seeing which way the wind blew, joined in. The Targaryens had come home, not as shattered exiles, but as a powerful pair commanding for dragons. When Daenerys seated herself upon the Iron Throne, The metal still bore the warmth of the midday sun that had shone through the collapsed windows. She let out a slow, steady breath. Viserys stood at her side, and she held out her hand to him. He took it, bowing slightly, the ghost of a grateful smile on his lips. And so it was that the Targaryen dynasty found new life, not through the single flame of a girl and her dragons, but through the joined fires of a brother and sister who had each been broken in their own ways, only to rise together. They both knew that ruling would bring fresh challenges. The realm was in tatters, and enemies still lurked beyond the city walls. The north had its own kings, the Iron Islands threatened rebellion, and the memory of the Mad King cast a long shadow. But with the dragons circling overhead and a spider in the shadows weaving support throughout the realm, the Targaryens were poised to reclaim the Seven Kingdoms fully. It would take more than a coronation to unify the land. They would have to address old grievances, negotiate with powerful houses, and show they could be just as well as strong. Yet, for the first time in a generation, the Iron Throne bore a Targaryen once more. In the days that followed, Cersei and Joffrey were tried for their crimes. The truth of Joffrey's parentage laid bare. Many Lannisters fled or submitted, seeking mercy. Tyrion Lannister, rumored to have vanished from King's Landing, eventually emerged from hiding and was granted an audience with Daenerys, offering his wit in service if she would spare him the sins of his family. Arya Stark, said to be lost or dead, reappeared with rumors of her own adventures. Jon Snow rose in the north, grappling with the secrets of his own parentage. All of these threads converged, forming a new tapestry of alliances and rivalries. Through it all, Daenerys and Viserys strove to maintain a balance that neither could have managed alone. Where Daenerys brought compassion, Viserys brought a sharper edge, cautioning her not to be too trusting. Where Viserys raged at the slightest betrayal, Daenerys urged him to see reason. Their dragons hunted in the skies above King's Landing, the symbol of House Targaryen's rebirth. At times, Viserys dreamed of the day he knelt in the desert sun with molten gold poised to kill him. He would jolt awake, drenched in sweat, hearing the echoes of the Dothraki's laughter. But when he looked around and saw Orion curled at the foot of his bed, golden scales rising and falling with each breath, he remembered that he had been spared for a purpose. He felt gratitude for the spider's hidden hand, for the second chance he had been given. The memory of that near death kept him humble. And Daenerys, in her own quiet moments, recalled how she had cowered under her brother's cruelty once. Yet now, she saw a man who sought redemption, who had risked everything to stand by her side. Perhaps it was not perfect forgiveness, but it was a bridge across a rift that had once seemed unbridgeable. In the final reckoning, it was Varys' carefully orchestrated intrigues that ensured the realm accepted this new two-headed Targaryen rule with minimal bloodshed. He sowed enough confusion among the Lannisters and their dwindling allies to prevent a united front. He subtly encouraged rebellious whispers among the small folk against Joffrey's tyranny. By the time the Targaryen banners appeared on the horizon, the city was half ready to welcome them. Once peace had somewhat settled on King's Landing, Varys slipped back into public view, professing loyalty to Daenerys and Viserys. They both knew his role, though they did not broadcast it. They understood that the spider was as dangerous as he was invaluable. Varys, for his part, looked upon the siblings and saw his grand experiment fulfilled. 2 Targaryens had returned, forging a new epoch for the Seven Kingdoms. It remained to be seen if they would rule wisely, but he had set the stage for them. The rest was in their hands. And so, as the years stretched on, the realm saw 2 Targaryens upon the Iron Throne in all but name. Daenerys, the crowned queen, and Viserys, her recognized partner in governance. No longer a beggar, no longer a mad pretender, but a king in practice if not in formal title. The small folk would say that King Viserys, for that was what many called him eventually, in quiet corners of the realm, had been tempered by the mother of dragons herself. He took no wife at first, focusing on the rebuilding of a shattered realm, working tirelessly to restore roads, quell rebellions, and unify the noble houses. Daenerys, too, found that the daily burdens of rule tested every fiber of her being, forcing her to make compromises she once swore she never would. In those times, She relied on her brother's advice. Their dragons grew ever larger, an ever-present reminder that the Targaryens' power rested not only in armies but in the living flame of their heritage. From the Red Keep's highest tower, they would sometimes watch the dragons wool over Blackwater Bay, their roars echoing off the distant hills. Daenerys would remember the day she stepped into Drogo's funeral pyre, how she had felt the flames lick her skin without burning, how she had emerged reborn. Viserys would recall the day he knelt in the dust before Khal Drogo, expecting death, only to be snatched away by Sellswords paid by a secret spider. Two siblings, shaped by fire and humiliation, had arrived at this moment against all odds. House Targaryen was no longer a fallen dynasty. It was a living force with two heads, two riders of dragons, a brother and sister who had found a precarious harmony in shared purpose. Whether they would succeed in the long run, whether they would bring an era of peace or simply ignite new conflicts, was something only the gods could know. Yet the realm looked upon them with a mixture of fear and hope. In taverns from Dorne to the north, the small folk spoke in hushed tones of the dragons that soared once more across the skies, of a queen who freed slaves and a king who overcame his own demons. Bards composed songs of the Targaryen siblings, forging a new age of dragons. And in the quiet gloom of the Red Keep's corridors, the spider listened, smiling a secret smile, for he knew that all of it, the triumphant return, the forging of alliances, the shift in power, hinged on that single pivotal moment in the Dothraki Sea, when molten gold had been poised to end a Targaryen line forever, only to be thwarted by a whisper and a bribe. Had that moment played out differently, Daenerys might have stood alone, her path changed in unguessable ways. But with Viserys alive and ultimately transformed, the realm now bore witness to a new chapter of fire and blood, guided by two dragons where once there was only one. In the final analysis, no one could say whether Viserys had truly shed every shred of the arrogance that once defined him. In times of great crisis, the ghosts of the past would stir, and he would wrestle with old impulses. But Daenerys, too, carried ghosts. Her child that never drew breath, her Khal who perished, the slaves she failed to save. In each other, they found an anchor to keep from being overwhelmed by nightmares. While it lasted, their reign gave the realm a brief glimmer of unity. The Northern Lords saw the dragons as a new southern threat, but they were too exhausted by their own wars to mount immediate opposition. The Vale remained aloof, waiting to see which way the wind blew. The Tyrells bent the knee in the face of overwhelming draconic power. Even the Greyjoys, always eager for independence, found themselves forced to acknowledge the Targaryens. In time, alliances shifted, heirs were born, and the realm continued its endless cycle of war and peace. But for a season, the Targaryen siblings kept the realm from imploding, their dragons soaring as living emblems of House Targaryen's motto, fire and blood. All because Varys, the spider, had intervened in a moment no one else witnessed or cared about, plucking Viserys Targaryen from the jaws of death. The memory of that rescue lingered at the edges of Viserys' mind, a reminder of how close he had come to a golden crown of molten metal. Now, as he walked the halls of the Red Keep, he sometimes paused before the spot where Jaime Lannister had once slain the Mad King, the father of Viserys and Daenerys. So many Targaryens had died in these halls. In one sense, it felt like a hollow victory, but in another sense, it felt like destiny fulfilled. He placed a hand on a cold stone column, closed his eyes, and silently thanked the hidden players who had believed he could be more than the petty tyrant he once was. And in the throne room, Daenerys Targaryen sat upon the Iron Throne, hearing petitions and planning for the wars to come. Two dragons, siblings in more ways than blood, had returned to the seat of their ancestors. How history would judge them, only time would tell. But for now, at least, a new dynasty of the dragon had risen from the ashes, and the realm, trembling between hope and terror, awaited its fate. In the aftermath of King's Landing's surrender, sunlight spilled through shattered windows in the Red Keep, illuminating dust motes swirling through the throne room where Daenerys Targaryen had placed herself upon the Iron Throne. Viserys lingered at her right hand, his expression caught somewhere between disbelief and resolve. The small folk, the lords, and even the reluctant Lannister soldiers had watched the siblings ascend to power with a mixture of fear, hope, and resignation. Now, Daenerys reigned as Queen of the Seven Kingdoms, and Viserys, no longer a beggar prince, stood as a partner in governance and conquest. For dragons circled the skies, casting flickering shadows on the streets of the capital. Those first days of Targaryen restoration were defined by what would later be called the Great Sorting. The siblings sought to separate the guilty from the innocent, the loyal from the faithless. Daenerys presided over hasty trials for men accused of atrocities committed in Joffrey's name. Some knights came forward, confessing involvement in the torture of small folk or the persecution of Ned Stark's household. Others insisted they had only ever followed orders. In these judgments, Daenerys's compassion clashed with her sense of justice. She did not want to echo her father's madness, burning men for sport. Yet she would not allow those who had relished murder and terror to walk free. Many were stripped of rank and lands. Some were thrown into cells, awaiting further judgment. A smaller handful of egregious offenders, rapists, torturers were fed to the dragons. The small folk watched both in horror and in grim satisfaction. Word spread swiftly that this new queen carried both mercy and wrath in her slender hands. Viserys, still learning to temper his old anger with the new humility he had gained, played an influential if quieter role in these proceedings. While Daenerys was the face of the throne, Viserys took it upon himself to reorganize the city watch, removing corrupt officers once loyal to Littlefinger or the Lannisters. He recalled his humiliations from the time of exile, how powerlessness bred anger and desperation. So he resolved to ensure that ordinary citizens might approach the Red Keep with grievances and not be turned away. At night, in the fortress's private corridors, he struggled with the question of how much to punish men who had merely protected their own families by serving Joffrey. He argued privately with Daenerys about the lines between loyalty, fear, and complicity. More than once, Daenerys found him pacing alone near the windows, staring out at the sprawl of King's Landing, wrestling with half-remembered notions of what a Targaryen king should be. Meanwhile, the city's mood fluctuated. A sense of uneasy relief flooded many quarters. Cersei and Joffrey were no longer in power, and the tyrannical impulses of the boy king had ended. But the presence of dragons overhead kindled dread. These were not the docile illusions of old songs but living beasts. Each time Drogon swooped low, small folk scrambled for cover, children wailing in terror. Orion, the gold-scaled dragon that had once been chained in Pentos, followed Viserys everywhere. Smaller than the black dread that Daenerys rode, Orion seemed more precise in flight, less prone to rampage. Many in King's Landing noted that this signified a difference in temperament between the siblings. Daenerys's fiery authority often manifested like Drogon's furious breath, whereas Viserys was sharper, more deliberate, like Orion's controlled bursts of flame. Overseeing the swirl of new alliances and old grudges, Varys began to reassert his influence, albeit without the theatrical coyness he had once displayed during Robert's reign. He would appear in the hallways, bowing demurely to Daenerys and Viserys, offering small bits of intelligence about rebellious movements in the countryside. At Daenerys's command, he assembled a network of informants in the Crownlands to glean which lords might remain secret Lannister loyalists. Varys did all of this with that same serene mien, yet Daenerys sensed an undercurrent of satisfaction in his every nod. He had spun this web for years, orchestrating the Targaryen siblings' reunion across the sea. Now his queen sat the throne, and his quiet, triumphant gaze revealed more than words ever could. Cersei Lannister, once queen regent, lingered in a tower cell. Daenerys had spared her from immediate execution but made no promises for her future. Joffrey, stripped of his claim and the illusions of rightful birth, languished in a lower dungeon. On the third day following the city's fall, Daenerys summoned an open court to decide their fate. Lords, knights, and curious small folk crammed into the throne room. Ser Barristan Selmy stood by the queen's side, an imposing figure in polished white plate. Viserys stood close, wearing black and red leathers, a small golden dragon head clasped at his throat. Above them, perched in the broken rafters, Drogon and Orion glared down at the crowd, eyes glowing with primal menace. Cersei was led forth by two unsullied, wrists bound in front of her. Even in captivity, she carried herself with a regal tilt of the chin. The hush in the hall was thick. Daenerys rose, her face schooled to calm. "Cersei of House Lannister," she intoned, "your reign brought suffering to the realm. Yet we would hear your plea before passing final judgment." A flicker of contempt passed over Cersei's face, though she lowered her gaze. "Your Grace," she said, "the realm has known war for years, and not all deeds done in the name of the crown were mine alone. Joffrey was king. Tywin Lannister was hand. You are a mother yourself, are you not? Would you not do all in your power to see your children safe?" Daenerys's eyes flashed, remembering the stillborn child she had lost in the Dothraki Sea. "You speak of children's safety, yet you unleashed your boy king upon the realm. Let him flay and torment his subjects. This is no excuse." Cersei's lips thinned. She looked to Viserys, as if trying to glean a hint of mercy there. Viserys offered only a blank stare. He recalled how the Lannisters had destroyed his family, how Jaime Lannister had slain their father, and how Tywin's men had killed Rhaenys and Aegon, children of Rhaegar. The memory still festered in Targaryen hearts. Yet Viserys also felt no triumph in seeing Cersei like this, only a strange emptiness. He said quietly, "Queens must answer for their crimes, even if they believed they acted for their brood." Cersei clenched her fists in her chains. "Then pass your sentence. I won't beg." Daenerys paused, glancing at the watchers. Many among the gathered small folk and lords had loathed Cersei, blaming her for famine, for torture, for countless misdeeds. They waited, breath bated, hoping for vengeance or dreading more bloodshed. Some remembered the cruelties that a Targaryen king once inflicted. But Daenerys was determined to show that the new Targaryens were not a mirror of the old. She inhaled and cast her gaze to the far corners of the hall, as though searching for an unseen presence. Then, in a voice neither cold nor merciful, she said, "Your child, Tommen, is innocent. I will not end him on account of your sins. As for you, Cersei Lannister, I will spare your life, but your wealth, your privileges, and your claim to any seat of power in the Seven Kingdoms are forfeit. You shall remain here, a prisoner until I deem otherwise. Should you attempt to escape or incite rebellion, you will burn." Cersei's face paled. She knew what a dragon's flames could do, but she stood rigid, refusing to yield to tears. The guards seized her by the arms and led her away. A murmur swept through the hall. Some had expected a burning. This display of partial mercy began to shape the growing narrative that Daenerys Targaryen was both fearsome and measured. Even so, the ghost of the Mad King hovered in every corner, and many wondered if Daenerys' sense of restraint might someday fail her. Next came Joffrey, prodded forward in chains, bruised and sullen. Lannister guards who had not fled or died in the assault stood off to one side, unsure where their loyalties now lay. At the sight of his mother's absence, Joffrey's eyes flickered with panic, but he squared his shoulders. The boy's arrogance had not entirely abandoned him. He glared up at Daenerys, scarcely believing he was dethroned. The throne room fell to a hush as he spat, "I am the king. You have no right." He got no further, for a single crack of a whip from an unsullied soldier silenced him. Daenerys leaned forward on the Iron Throne. "In the sight of gods and men, you are no trueborn son of Robert Baratheon," she said. "Your claim was built on a lie. You have terrorized the realm, executed Lord Eddard Stark under false pretenses, and wrought havoc upon the Riverlands. For these crimes you stand condemned." Joffrey's face flushed red. His fury, unleashed in tantrums all his young life, found no outlet here. He quavered, raking terrified eyes across the faces of those in attendance. None would meet his gaze, not even the Lannister men who had once sworn to defend him. Daenerys turned to Viserys. "Brother," she said softly, her voice echoing under the high ceilings. "What penalty would you recommend for a false king who has killed honest men, starved the city, and brought shame to the crown?" Viserys did not savor the moment as he might have years ago. He had learned too many lessons of cruelty, how it ended only in further cruelty. Yet he also knew the realm demanded some reckoning. "He must stand as an example," Viserys said at last. "This realm cannot abide the memory of his tyranny, nor can we allow him any chance to sow chaos again. If you would show mercy to Cersei, then perhaps let the realm see that you are just as capable of stern justice for the boy. I believe the block is the kinder fate." Daenerys inclined her head, acknowledging the logic. Joffrey's eyes went wide. He tried to speak, but the unsullied soldiers dragged him from the chamber before he could stutter any further protests. A hush settled. Daenerys did not need to look at the fearful crowd to know they awaited the final word. "He will die," she said, her tone subdued, "and so the line of this false monarchy ends." The next dawn, as the sun rose pink over Blackwater Bay, Joffrey Baratheon knelt at the block in a courtyard ringed by Unsullied. Ser Barristan performed the execution with a single clean stroke. Daenerys had wrestled with whether to do it herself, remembering her talk with Ned Stark's daughter, long vanished from the city, about the Northmen's code of passing judgment. But in the end, she decided Barristan was best suited to the task. Her own presence might only feed rumors that she was quick to shed blood. Nevertheless, the moment the sword fell, Daenerys felt a tremor of finality. Another era had ended, and a new order was taking root. That same morning, Daenerys went to the walls of the Red Keep to stand alongside Viserys, looking out upon the city. Even at such an early hour, the markets bustled with commerce, the common folk hoping for a brighter future. But the Targaryens knew too well how fragile the capital's fortunes could be. Winter approached, the coffers were depleted, and there were still wars beyond the horizon. Viserys laid a hand on the stone battlement, the gold dragon Orion perched behind him, flicking its tail. "So many things to mend," he murmured. "We have a city that needs feeding, a realm that needs uniting, and enemies who will test us at every turn." Daenerys nodded. "We'll do it one step at a time," she said. "We will show them we are not our father. We will show them we will not plunge the realm into madness. Together." Word of the Targaryen victory spread like wildfire throughout the Seven Kingdoms. In the Riverlands, there was cautious celebration, for Joffrey's men had tormented them during the war. In the Westerlands themselves, the Lannisters who remained at Casterly Rock seethed, uncertain whether to mount a last stand under Kevan Lannister or to sue for peace. The Vale, under the rule of the ailing Lisa Arryn, kept its gates shut, sending no official message. The North, still effectively led by Robb Stark, crowned king in the North after Ned Stark's death, waited in frosty silence. Though House Stark's thirst for vengeance had been partially sated by Joffrey's downfall, they had no love for Targaryens who had once threatened them with dragonfire. Dorne, by contrast, was quietly pleased, remembering Prince Rhaegar with reverence and hoping the new Targaryen reign might hold the Lannisters to account for Elia Martell's murder. In the Red Keep, a new small council took shape. Daenerys designated Tyrion Lannister, recently arrived from hiding, contrite, and possessed of a keen political mind, as her master of coin. His presence was controversial. Many Targaryen loyalists despised the Lannister name, but Daenerys and Viserys each recognized Tyrion's brilliance. With the realm's finances in tatters, they needed a man cunning enough to rebuild them. Tyrion accepted, vowing in private to Daenerys that he would do whatever necessary to distance himself from the sins of his sister and father. Barristan Selmy, reaffirmed in Daenerys's trust, became Lord Commander of her Queensguard. Missandei, Daenerys's dearest advisor from across the sea, served now as the Queen's chief counselor in matters of diplomacy, her gentle presence counterbalancing the tension that often arose in the council chamber. Varys hovered in no official seat but served as Master of Whisperers, quietly collecting secrets. In a move that surprised many, Daenerys asked Viserys to act as her hand in all but name, especially when she traveled or attended to other pressing tasks. Viserys hesitated at first, haunted by memories of how a Targaryen father had once burned his own hand's family. But Daenerys insisted. "Who else understands my vision for this realm as deeply as you?" she said. "Who else shares the burdens of our house?" He accepted. And so, The next week saw Viserys behind the council table day after day, sifting through reports of bandits, possible Lannister uprisings, and the precarious harvest yields. He felt the weight of that responsibility like a chain around his neck. Yet the chain was one he had chosen. He had once believed wearing a crown would be simple. Now, faced with the reality of governance, he saw the labyrinth of burdens that a king or queen must shoulder. And he realized that perhaps Daenerys was better suited to be the figurehead upon the throne. Her presence inspired love in a way his never had. He accepted that truth with less bitterness than he might have expected. For once, he found meaning in service, trusting that he shaped policy from behind the scenes, ensuring the realm would not starve, that the freedmen from Meereen would find a place in this new order, that House Targaryen would not slip into old habits of tea. Granny. Still, challenges rose from every corner. A raven from Casterly Rock arrived, bearing Kevan Lannister's seal. A demand that his niece and any Lannisters left in King's Landing be returned, along with an offer of fealty if House Targaryen recognized Lannister rights to certain gold mines. Tyrion read the letter, eyebrows arched, and offered a dry laugh. "My uncle," he said in the council chamber. Practical as always, he would rather strike a bargain than see the Westerlands burn. But do we trust him? Daenerys tapped her fingers on the table. "Trust is earned," she murmured. "But war with the Westerlands would cost us soldiers, time, and coin we do not have. If the Lannisters are truly prepared to bend the knee, we can consider their terms, within reason." Viserys recalled the torments inflicted upon Targaryen children during the sack of King's Landing. Yet he also knew that if they turned House Lannister into an eternal enemy, the realm would never settle. "We can demand proper hostages," he suggested, "not out of cruelty, but to ensure no treachery. If Kevan truly bends the knee, let him send one of his heirs to court. Once we see they hold to their word, perhaps we can confirm their minds." Tyrion nodded. "You're catching on to the realities of Westerosi politics, brother-in-law." He said the term wryly, for though they were not bound by marriage, they were bound now by necessity, both loyal, at least in word, to Daenerys. The council agreed that a delegation would be sent to Casterly Rock to negotiate. Thus, another piece of the realm's mosaic fell into place. Far more worrying was the silence from the north. Ravens came and went, carrying messages that were never answered. Reports indicated that Robb Stark's forces remained entrenched in the Riverlands, while the Boltons ruled the North's heartland with an uneasy grip. Dark rumors swirled of tensions between the Stark bannermen. Some said that the Karstarks had turned away from Robb in bitterness, others that House Bolton's methods were savage. But no one offered clarity. One evening, Daenerys summoned Viserys to her private solar, an airy chamber lit by flickering lamps. The dragons had grown large enough that she kept them in the castle yard or beyond, letting them hunt in the fields outside the city. Inside, she kept only small braziers for comfort. When Viserys entered, he found his sister seated on a cushioned window seat, poring over a rolled map of Westeros. She glanced up, beckoning him closer. "Brother," she said, "we have reports that the North is locked in conflict not just with itself but with some darker threat. My men speak of rumors from beyond the wall. Walkers, whites, an ancient evil. Do you credit such stories?" Viserys frowned, remembering half-forgotten tales from their childhood. The White Walkers had always been ghost stories, used to frighten children into obedience. "I do not know," he said carefully. "But the men of the Night's Watch do not often lie about threats in the far north. If there is something real up there, the realm could be in danger." Daenerys sighed. "Then we must find a way to speak with Robb Stark. The last we heard, he crowned himself king in the north after his father was executed. Our victory over Joffrey might ease his hatred, or it might not. The Starks have every reason to distrust Targaryens after what our father did to Rickard and Brandon Stark." Viserys ran a hand through his silver-gold hair. "We could offer them peace, an alliance, or at least a truce. If the White Walkers are real, the North will need southern aid. But first, we must open a line of communication. We cannot force them to the table with threats of dragonfire." He paused, a ghost of a bitter smile tugging at his lips. "At least, Not if we truly wish for them to join us willingly. Daenerys smiled back, though it held sadness. I never wanted to conquer my father's enemies only to be left with ashes. I would do things differently if I could. But here we are. She rolled up the map. We'll send an envoy north with the best intentions. If they don't respond, we'll try another way. 2 days later, the Queen's royal envoy, accompanied by a small retinue of Unsullied and a handful of Westerosi knights, rode out from the capital toward the Trident. Official letters bearing Daenerys' seal and an invitation to treat followed, each addressed to Robb Stark, King in the North at Riverrun. Only time would tell if the Northern King would reply. In the meantime, King's Landing demanded constant attention. Food shortages plagued the streets, the Gold Cloaks struggled to keep crime in check, and the scars of war marred entire neighborhoods. Tyrion busied himself arranging shipments of grain from the Reach, forging alliances with merchants in Old Town. Viserys met with city officials daily, pressing them to expedite repairs on the city's walls, aqueducts, and markets. Though the freedmen who had followed Daenerys from across the narrow sea had proven loyal, they too needed housing, work, and acceptance in an often xenophobic city. Tensions erupted one hot afternoon when a riot broke out near Flea Bottom, driven by rumors that the new queen was a foreign conqueror who would raise taxes to feed her brown-skinned soldiers. The Gold Cloaks rushed in, swords drawn. By the time the dust settled, 7 were dead, including 2 freedmen battered to death by angry locals. Viserys stood in the aftermath, feeling both rage and guilt knot in his stomach as he witnessed the broken bodies. He had believed the small folk would eventually embrace Daenerys, but old prejudices lingered like the stench of rotting fish in the alleyways. That evening, Daenerys announced that the Red Keep's gates would open to the common folk for a special audience. She gathered them in a broad courtyard where her dragons could be seen perched atop crenellations, a silent warning against violence. Arrayed behind her were freedmen, Unsullied, Gold Cloaks, and Westerosi knights alike, an image of unity she was determined to present. The crowd muttered uneasy, but they listened. Daenerys spoke of how she had freed thousands in Slaver's Bay, how she wished to see no one in Westeros enslaved by fear or hunger. She promised she would not punish the city for the actions of the few. She demanded that the freedmen be permitted to live in peace, and that all disputes be settled under the same law. "I am no usurper," she declared, her voice carrying in the humid air, "and I am no foreigner to your struggles. My house was born in the heart of this very land, and I have returned to heal what was broken." It was a speech carefully crafted, no doubt with Tyrion's help, to evoke both her Valyrian heritage and her claim upon the 7 kingdoms. The crowd dispersed uncertainly, but the immediate anger was tempered. Viserys saw that, for all their dread of dragons, many small folk craved stability more than they craved vengeance or xenophobia. If the Targaryens could feed them, keep them safe, they might yet win the city's heart. As the days turned into weeks, Daenerys and Viserys found a tenuous balance between fear and love, forging alliances with local guilds, ensuring bread prices remained steady, and publicly punishing any freedmen who committed crimes against Westerosi citizens, just as they punished Westerosi who harmed freedmen. Slowly, the city began to breathe again, mending from the trauma of Joffrey's reign and the sacking that never quite occurred but that many had feared. Amid these domestic challenges, word finally arrived from Robb Stark. The Queen's envoy returned with a single parchment sealed with the dire wolf of House Stark. Written in a careful, heavy hand was a brief message. "We of the North do not forget. The Targaryen name once burned our kin. Yet you have ended the Lannisters' tyranny. Perhaps we may speak. I remain Robb Stark, King in the North." With the letter came an invitation to Parley at Riverrun, where Robb and his bannermen currently held seat. Daenerys read the words aloud to Viserys, Tyrion, and Barristan in the council chamber. Many eyebrows were raised at the title King in the North, but Daenerys did not flinch. "He's acknowledging our defeat of the Lannisters while clinging to his own crown," she mused. "He has no reason to surrender his independence easily." Viserys tapped the table. "He's offering to talk, at least. That's more than we had. We should go. If the North is threatened by these rumored White Walkers, the realm itself could be in peril. Tyrion looked thoughtful. And if it's merely a rumor, we stand to gain an alliance with one of the oldest and proudest houses in Westeros. An alliance that could stabilize half the continent and free us to handle other threats. Barristan studied Daenerys, concern etched in the lines of his weathered face. My queen, a parley is dangerous. The Riverlands are not entirely secure, and you would be placing yourself in Stark territory. Let me urge caution. Daenerys's eyes held calm determination. I will not cower in the Red Keep while the realm remains divided. Robb Stark lost his father to Joffrey's cruelty, but not to ours. If there is a chance to mend old wounds, we must try. I will go to Riverrun. Drogon will accompany me, as will a contingent of Unsullied. That should deter any betrayal. Viserys stirred, uneasy. A part of him remembered the cruelty their father inflicted on Rickard and Brandon Stark, how that had ignited Robert's rebellion. The Starks had every reason to hate House Targaryen. But Daenerys was right. This was the best chance to bring the North into the fold without further bloodshed. I'll come as well, he said. Orien and I, we are better together. So it was decided. Preparations began for the royal procession to depart. Tyrion would remain behind as a caretaker for the city and master of coin, orchestrating the distribution of food and the delicate negotiations with the Lannisters at Casterly Rock. Varys, too, chose to remain, citing that his little birds needed careful handling in the capital. Ser Barristan and Missandei would accompany Daenerys and Viserys, along with a disciplined honor guard of Unsullied, freedmen cavalry, and a score of Westerosi knights who had sworn fealty in recent weeks. The entire retinue numbered no more than a few hundred, but the presence of 2 dragons was enough to fend off any brigands. The day they set forth, the city's gates were lined with onlookers, some cheering the queen's name, others merely gawking at the dragons that soared overhead. Daenerys rode upon Drogon, who dwarfed Orien by a full third in size, his black scales glinting in the sun. Viserys mounted Orien, who had grown lean and swift, with bright gold eyes that scanned the crowds warily. Missandei traveled in a carriage, Barristan rode a fine courser, and the Unsullied marched in close formation. The journey across the Crownlands and into the Riverlands took over 2 weeks, slowed by wagons carrying supplies and by the necessity of letting the dragons hunt. At each village and holdfast, the people warily emerged, having heard of Targaryen dragons but never expecting to see them so close. Daenerys made a point of speaking to local elders, promising them that the war taxes imposed under Joffrey's reign would be lifted. She listened to their complaints, bandits near old battlefields, crops burned by passing armies. While the freedmen among her guard reminded some folks of invaders, Daenerys's willingness to hear them gradually eased tensions. One twilight, as they camped beside a half-ruined sept near an abandoned battlefield, Daenerys and Viserys walked the site together. Broken swords and rusting helms littered the weeds. The smell of old death lingered. A cold wind blew from the east, making the torches flicker. Viserys felt a shudder. So many bodies rotted here in the war, he murmured. Look at all these sigils, Baratheon, Stark, Lannister. 1,000 little battles leading nowhere, it seems. Daenerys's face was solemn. We must be different, she said, or the realm will devour itself, dragons or no. They spent the night with their retinue, dragons perched on the sept's remains. Stars glittered overhead, and wolves howled in the distance. Daenerys dreamt of a great wall of ice, stretching into the black sky, and shapes moving beyond it. The dream left her uneasy in the morning. Viserys noticed her mood but said nothing. He too had felt a chill in the air that went beyond the normal autumn crispness. Riverrun rose on the banks of the Red Fork of the Trident, its triangular shape imposing even after the wars that had swept through. Robb Stark had made it his seat after inheriting the Tully alliance. When Daenerys's retinue arrived, they beheld banners of the direwolf and the trout flapping from the battlements. Armed men lined the walls. The drawbridge lowered slowly as a herald announced the arrival of Daenerys Targaryen, rightful queen of the 7 kingdoms, and her brother Viserys Targaryen. Inside, the castle courtyard thrummed with tension. Northerners in wolf-crested armor watched with open curiosity, many frowning at the sight of Unsullied with spears and freedmen cavalry on strange mounts. Daenerys dismounted from Drogon with a regal grace, though the dragon hissed warily at all the steel-clad strangers. Viserys landed Orien nearby, the gold dragon's tail lashing the dust. He raised a hand for calm, commanding the freedmen to remain alert but not aggressive. Then came Robb Stark, stepping down from the main keep. He was broad-shouldered, auburn-haired like his Tully mother, and wore fur-trimmed leathers despite the southern warmth. On his left strode the black-clad figure of Brynden Blackfish Tully, a capable warrior and cunning mind. On Robb's right, a great gray direwolf padded silently, hackles raised. Gray Wind's amber eyes regarded the dragons with something akin to animal outrage, as if no beast had ever dared to surpass the direwolf in a display of might. Daenerys inclined her head. "My Lord Stark," she began, her voice clear. "Or should I say, Your Grace, I come in peace at your invitation." Robb's expression was guarded, though not hostile. He studied Daenerys a moment, then Viserys, then the dragons behind them. "Queen Daenerys," he said, "your presence here is unexpected but not unwelcome. We have heard tales of your arrival in King's Landing, your removal of Joffrey, your alliance with—" He paused, flicking his gaze at the freedmen. "All manner of folk. We will talk." That was all the greeting offered. Yet it was more than an open threat. Daenerys nodded, a small relief stirring in her chest. Robb gestured for them to follow into the great hall of Riverrun. Beyond the broad doors lay a modest but sturdy hall, with plain banners of the wolf and trout hanging above. The Targaryen retinue remained in the courtyard, except for a few chosen representatives. Daenerys, Viserys, Missandei, Ser Barristan, and 2 unsullied guards. The northern lords had assembled in rows on either side. Small wonder, Daenerys thought, they wished to display unity. Among them, she spied the tall form of Roose Bolton, pale-eyed and unnerving, as well as the hulking Great Jon Umber, who glowered at the Targaryens but said nothing. The Blackfish hovered to one side, arms folded, keen gaze never leaving Daenerys. At the far end of the hall stood the dais, where Robb Stark's chair was flanked by the banners of House Stark and House Tully. Robb settled himself, resting one hand on the pommel of a sword. The direwolf, Grey Wind, prowled behind him, rumbling softly whenever Viserys moved a step closer. Daenerys could feel the weight of the North's anger in the air. She pushed aside her own nervousness. She was a queen who had walked through fire and lived. She would not cower before men who had once known her father's cruelty. Robb spoke first, his voice echoing. "You claim the Iron Throne. Why come here to the king in the north?" Daenerys locked eyes with him. "We come because the realm cannot endure further division. The War of the Five Kings has ravaged these lands, as we have all seen. I seek a path toward unity or at least peace. I know your father died unjustly at the command of Joffrey. That same tyrant I have deposed, and my father's actions, burning Lord Rickard Stark and his son, were monstrous. We cannot change the past, but we can shape the future. If you will speak with me, we may find common ground." A stir rippled through the northern lords. Some looked unconvinced, others merely curious. Robb glanced at Bolton, the Great Jon, and the Blackfish. Then his gaze returned to Daenerys. "Your father's crimes remain unforgiven, yet you have ended the Lannister menace that caused the death of my father. That is not a small thing." Viserys stepped forward, ignoring the low growl from Grey Wind. "We come bearing more than an offer of peace. We bring warning of a threat that could overshadow all our squabbles. Rumors out of the far north, beyond the wall. We have heard tales of White Walkers. We know not if they are real, but if they are, then every kingdom in Westeros stands at risk." Roose Bolton let out a soft exhalation of contempt. "Childish tales," he murmured, though his voice carried. "If the Targaryens think we are children to be frightened by nightmares, perhaps you should return to your city of gullible fools." Daenerys's temper flickered. She recalled hearing of House Bolton's cruelty, the flaying traditions. But Robb raised a hand to silence Bolton. "We have heard rumors ourselves," he admitted. "Free folk crossing the wall, fleeing something terrible in the Frostfangs. The Night's Watch sent messages asking for men and supplies. My father considered the wall our responsibility. But with war raging, I have not had the resources to spare." Daenerys breathed a silent sigh of relief. At least he did not dismiss it outright. "The threat is real enough that rumors abound from Eastwatch to Castle Black. I do not ask you to kneel to me in blind faith," she continued. "But if we unite, if we share resources, we can reinforce the wall and discover the truth of this threat. We might save thousands of lives." A murmur swept the hall. The Great John snorted. "And in return, the North surrenders to Southern rule again?" Viserys lifted his chin. "We offer an alliance. My sister does not demand your immediate fealty. She would rather see us stand together against the coming winter. Perhaps we can talk about the shape of that unity, rather than rehashing old hatreds." He glanced toward Bolton, uncertain of how the Pale Lord might react. But it was Robb who answered, arms folded. "I will not kneel to another Targaryen after what happened to my grandfather and uncle. Not unless I see reason to believe this time is different." Daenerys met his gaze squarely. "I'm not my father, nor is my brother. If you require proof of our sincerity, name your terms. We can discuss them, but let us start with a truce. No northern swords raised against Targaryen forces, no Targaryen fire unleashed upon the north. Let us see what good can come from shared counsel." Silence stretched. Grey winds panting was the only sound. At last, Brynden Tully stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Your Grace," he said to Robb, "it cannot hurt to discuss terms. The Riverlands have bled enough." He turned his flinty gaze upon Daenerys. "My niece was Lady Catelyn Tully. Lord Eddard Stark was her husband. If you truly regret what the Mad King did to this family, you must show it in deed, not just word." Daenerys inclined her head. "I am prepared to do so." So began the negotiations. Over several days, the Targaryen party remained housed within Riverrun's guest quarters. The presence of the dragons and the hundreds of Unsullied outside the walls ensured no attempt was made upon Daenerys' life. For their part, Daenerys and Viserys took care never to threaten the Starks with dragonfire, which might have reignited old hatreds. Slowly, grudgingly, the two sides found points of agreement. The North was exhausted from war, wishing to secure its borders and feed its people. Daenerys possessed the resources of the Crownlands and the Reach, albeit tenuously, and proposed shipping grain north. Robb insisted on the right to govern the North's internal affairs, so long as no aggression was directed at the Iron Throne. In essence, a semi-autonomous North, acknowledging Daenerys' monarchy but not truly bending the knee. In an earlier age, the Targaryens would have demanded more. But Daenerys recognized that insisting on an oath of fealty might drive Robb back to open war, fracturing the realm again. Better to secure him as an ally in reality, even if not in name. Viserys supported her, remembering how tyranny had undone House Targaryen once before. "Better a friend in the North than another rebellious king," he said in private. The most sensitive subject, though, was the matter of White Walkers. Robb's bannermen still viewed it with skepticism. Yet the Night's Watch had renewed its pleas, sending ravens daily. The watchers on the wall reported strange sightings, deserted wildling villages, unnatural storms. Daenerys proposed sending an expedition north to see the threat firsthand, to bring evidence back to the Southern Lords if it existed. Robb, suspecting a trap, hesitated, until Brynden Tully volunteered to lead a small group alongside whoever the Queen chose to send. "Let us see these others for ourselves," the Blackfish said grimly. "If we find nothing but snow and tales, at least we can say we tried to know the truth. And if we do find horrors, better we discover it in time to prepare." Daenerys considered going herself but realized the realm needed her present in King's Landing. Viserys, feeling a flicker of old restlessness, offered to fly north on Orion. A single rider on Dragonback could travel swiftly, but if the threat turned real, he might need the support of an entire retinue. In the end, they decided that Jon Stark, rumored to be Robb's half-brother, a sworn brother of the Night's Watch, was the figure best positioned to guide them at the wall. They would all converge near Castle Black if the expedition discovered something truly dire. Such was the framework of the agreement hammered out in Riverrun: a mutual truce, shipments of southern grain heading north, and an investigative mission to the wall. Robb Stark refused to name Daenerys as his queen outright. Instead, he granted her safe passage, recognized the Targaryen restoration in the south, and agreed not to war upon her so long as she did not threaten the North's sovereignty. A precarious peace, some called it, but it was peace nonetheless. Daenerys offered to send a small detachment of Unsullied to help man the wall if the threat proved real. Robb, in turn, promised to keep his men away from any further southern entanglements. On the final night before Daenerys' departure, the Lords of the North and the Targaryens shared a strained feast in Riverrun's hall. The tension softened slightly as wine and ale flowed. Great John Umber even bellowed out a rowdy drinking song, to which some freedmen responded with their own Essosi chant, creating a bizarre mix of rhythms. Daenerys and Robb spoke in low tones near the high table, discussing the rigors of rule and the heartbreak of war. Viserys, for his part, exchanged cautious words with Bolton. The Pale Lord unnerved him, but Viserys sensed a cunning mind behind those cold eyes. Roose Bolton offered vague courtesies, praising Daenerys' willingness to treat. Viserys found no sincerity in his compliments. At the feast's end, Daenerys stood, raising her cup. She spoke of a new dawn for a realm broken by old grudges, of a world that might soon be tested by a cold darkness. If winter truly comes as harshly as the stories say, she said, her voice carrying over the throng, then we have no choice but to stand together or die apart. Robb Stark regarded her for a long moment, then raised his own cup and took a drink. That was the closest thing to a public endorsement she would receive. A hush passed through the hall, followed by a slow, subdued applause. No rousing cheers, but no jeers either. In that measured acceptance, Daenerys found the seeds of hope. The next morning, the Targaryen forces departed, leaving behind a promise of ships loaded with southern grain. Robb Stark watched from the battlements as the dragons soared, black and gold, over the rivers. The freedmen cavalry trotted after them, carrying the Queen's banners, and the Unsullied marched in disciplined ranks. The Blackfish parted ways to gather men for the expedition to the wall. Bolton's expression revealed nothing, though he lingered in conversation with Robb once the Targaryens were out of earshot. Some said the North's nightmares were not from beyond the wall alone. Others whispered that the real monster in the North was House Bolton itself. But for now, an uneasy peace had been achieved. Daenerys and Viserys returned south with a sense that they had accomplished something, however fragile. The realm might stand a chance if the rumored threat truly loomed. Along the return route, they encountered their grain convoys already heading north, escorted by freedmen and gold cloaks. Peasants cheered the Queen's name, though some still eyed the dragons with anxious awe. Daenerys felt the burden of queenship heavier than ever. She had made promises to the north, to the freedmen, to King's Landing. If any vow shattered, the realm could spiral again into war. When they were within a day's ride of the capital, they paused at dusk. They had received a raven from Tyrion, urging haste. Something about finalizing negotiations with Kevan Lannister, plus unsettling news from the Iron Islands, where Balon Greyjoy had died, leaving the Sea Throne in question. Euron Greyjoy, a reaver known for his madness, might claim power there, adding yet another threat to the realm's fragile stability. Daenerys only had time for a few hours of restless sleep before the retinue rose again at first light, pushing on to the city. They arrived to find King's Landing in the midst of frenzied repair. The walls had been patched, new gates installed, and certain sections of the city, hitherto left in ruin by the war, were now bustling with carpenters and masons. Word had come from Casterly Rock that Kevan Lannister was prepared to bend the knee on behalf of the Westerlands. He had even sent his own son, Martin, as a hostage, now lodged in a comfortable suite at the Red Keep. Tyrion greeted Daenerys with a half-smile, though there was tension in his eyes. "We may yet have the Lannisters properly leashed," he said, "if we maneuver carefully." Viserys, who disliked the notion of any Lannister at court, studied Martin from afar. The boy seemed meek, wide-eyed at the sight of dragons perched on the castle ramparts. Tyrion assured Viserys that Kevan's line was more reasonable than Tywin's had been, more willing to preserve their lands than wage endless war. Still, old hatred died hard. Night fell on King's Landing, and Daenerys summoned her council. The hall was still being refurbished, so they met in a smaller chamber. Gathered around an oval table were Tyrion, Missandei, Ser Barristan, a freedman representative named Naharis, no relation to Dario, though he claimed distant kinship from the same city, and a handful of Westerosi knights who had joined House Targaryen after Joffrey's fall. Varys slipped in last, bowing deeply. The flickering candlelight cast shadows on his bald pate. Daenerys wasted no time. "We have a precarious peace with the North," she announced. "Lord Kevan Lannister offers submission if we grant the Westerlands favorable trade." The Iron Islands threaten to erupt in chaos under this Euron Greyjoy, who rumor says communes with dark powers. Her violet eyes swept the table. "Our coin is scarce, our people exhausted, and winter is coming. How do we hold this realm together?" Tyrion steepled his fingers. "First, we must finalize terms with Kevan Lannister. Offer him enough incentive to keep the Westerlands stable. He might help supply coin from their gold mines. In exchange, we promise no vengeful destruction. That secures the West. Next, we send an envoy to the Iron Islands, perhaps acknowledging them a measure of autonomy if they cease raiding the northern coast. Greyjoy ambition is a troublesome thing, but if Euron truly seizes power, we'd best know his aims. As for the north, that truce remains tenuous. We must keep up regular shipments of grain, perhaps station a small Targaryen presence in the Neck or at Moat Cailin, so we can respond quickly to any threat from beyond the wall." The freedman representative, Naharis, cleared his throat. "And what of us, your grace? Many freedmen came here believing in your promise of a better life. We need farmland, we need to integrate into your laws. This city is overcrowded." Daenerys nodded gravely. "I haven't forgotten. There are lands still unclaimed after the wars. The Crown can grant some holdings in the Crownlands and Stormlands, provided the freedmen vow to respect local laws. We'll arrange a program of settlement. Tyrion, see if we can finance that." Missandei added, "We must also ensure the freedmen are not treated as lesser. They fought for you. They bled for you. Yet some Westerosi lords may see them only as foreigners." A small murmur of agreement. Ser Barristan tapped the hilt of his sword. "We can station certain freedmen as local peacekeepers under the Crown's banner, much like the Gold Cloaks, to show they enforce the same laws as any born and bred Westerosi." Viserys exhaled, absorbing the breadth of challenges. He thought back to the childlike illusions he once held about ruling from the Iron Throne, how it seemed a simple matter of commanding others. Now he saw a realm that needed healing in every corner. "We must act swiftly but carefully," he said, then looked to Varys. "What tidings from the shadows, Lord Varys?" The spider folded his hands. "Dark tidings from the Iron Islands, indeed. Euron Greyjoy calls himself the Crow's Eye. He roams the seas with a fearsome crew, rumored to dabble in black sorcery. Some say he seeks a dragon horn from the ruins of Valyria. If that is more than myth, your dragons could be at risk. Meanwhile, in Essos, the city-states once cowed by your presence in Slaver's Bay may try to interfere if they sense you are overextended. But for now, none appear to have stirred beyond sending envoys. As for our dear Peter Baelish, he remains in the Vale, presumably ensconced near young Lord Robert Arryn. Their gates remain closed, no open hostility, yet no pledge of support." Daenerys' face hardened at the mention of Euron's rumored dragon horn. She remembered the old Valyrian stories, horns that could bind beasts to one's will, but at terrible cost. "We cannot let him threaten our children," she whispered, meaning the dragons. "We'll need to watch the seas carefully." Tyrion looked thoughtful. "If Euron attempts to breach Blackwater Bay, a well-placed alliance with House Redwyne or other naval powers might stymie him. The Arbor's fleet is considerable. We also have the growing Targaryen fleet in the Narrow Sea, commanded by men loyal from Slaver's Bay. Not enough to match Euron in an open ocean battle yet, but with cunning we might deter him. The council continued late into the night, hammering out the shape of the nascent Targaryen regime. When at last they emerged from the chamber, dawn was breaking through windows tinted a faint pink. Daenerys, exhausted, leaned on Viserys' arm. He too was weary, but a strange energy coursed through him. They had come so far, survived so much, yet the challenges only multiplied. They parted ways, Daenerys retiring to her royal apartments, where Drogon lay half asleep on a massive terrace overlooking the city. Viserys went to his own chambers, where Orien coiled around a high parapet, occasionally letting out a low hum that resonated through the stone. Viserys approached the dragon carefully, stroking its golden scales. "We are forging a new path, Orien," he murmured. "I never thought I'd choose it, but I have no regrets. Not now." The dragon blinked golden eyes, as though understanding. In the days that followed, the plan to settle freedmen in lands ravaged by war began in earnest. Kevan Lannister arrived in King's Landing to negotiate the Westerlands' pledge of loyalty. Daenerys treated him with politeness, though she refused to release Cersei or concede Lannister autonomy. The gold from Lannister mines would flow, enabling Tyrion to alleviate the crown's debts, an ironic twist that made Tyrion grin. Meanwhile, ships full of grain plied the waters to White Harbor to help feed the north, fulfilling Daenerys' promise to Robb Stark. Yet as the realm slowly knit itself together, ominous rumors multiplied. Euron Greyjoy was crowned king of the Iron Islands at a kingsmoot, expelling or killing rivals to his rule. Some said he had bound a monstrous beast from the eastern oceans to his service, that he practiced blood magic, that he wore a patch over one eye because it saw visions men were not meant to see. Daenerys' hold on the Iron Throne would remain tenuous as long as such threats lurked. Then came a raven from Castle Black, carrying dire news of whites prowling the snow, slaying rangers. The message concluded with a desperate plea from Lord Commander Jon Snow of the Night's Watch. "Winter is here. We need all the help we can get." When Daenerys read the letter aloud in the council chamber, no one spoke for a moment. The hush was broken by Barristan's quiet observation. "If the dead are truly walking, my queen, we may soon find ourselves fighting an enemy beyond all reason." Viserys felt a chill race down his spine. He recalled the dreamlike sense of dread that had come over him when they stood on that abandoned battlefield, the howling wind in the night. "We must confirm the threat," he said, aware that the words sounded hollow. The letter from the wall was confirmation enough for some, but still intangible. Blackfish Tully and his men may have reached the wall by now. If they return with proof, we must be ready. Daenerys slowly set the letter aside. "Then let us expedite the forging of alliances," she said. "Euron Greyjoy, the Vale, the Lannisters. All these quarrels are dust if we face an army of the dead." Tyrion cleared his throat. "We cannot possibly unify the entire realm in a fortnight. But if we show strong leadership, the lords may rally behind us. Might I suggest we attempt a grand summit? Invite the major houses to King's Landing, show them the reality of the threat. If we can secure a temporary truce among ourselves, we can march north with combined forces." "A grand summit?" Varys mused, fingertips against his lips. "Dangerous if the houses see it as a trap. But if we can present them with living proof of the undead, assuming we capture a white or bring some other evidence, it might shock them into cooperation. The question is, how do we acquire that proof?" Barristan said grimly. "We might need to send a small group beyond the wall. Risky, but it's the only way to capture one of these creatures. If it can even be done." Daenerys raked her fingers through her silver hair. "Time is short. If the White Walkers are as terrible as the old stories claim, the realm may face devastation worse than any war. Yes, we will try a summit. We will reach out to every Lord Paramount, to the north, to the Vale, to Dorne, to the Iron Islands, though I doubt Euron will come. We must try." Viserys met his sister's gaze, seeing the flicker of fear within her eyes. She had faced warlocks, slavers, even the usurpers' armies, but an ancient evil that raised the dead belonged to a different realm of horror. In a softer voice, he said, "We'll stand together, Dany. One way or another." She clasped his hand. "Yes, we've come this far, and we will not fail the realm now." Soon, ravens were dispatched to every corner of Westeros, carrying invitations to a gathering that might decide the fate of the living. The words were carefully chosen, referencing the old pacts between the North and the Crown, citing the immediate threat of northern terrors. They called upon the lords to put aside feuds and come to King's Landing to witness the truth. Many in the city whispered it would be a doomed venture. Too many wars, too much bad blood. But Daenerys believed that even the hardest hearts might be moved if they saw an undead horror clawing at their gates. Preparations for the rumored expedition beyond the wall began. Ser Jorah Mormont, exiled from Daenerys' presence for past betrayals, heard of the plan from his own vantage in the city and quietly volunteered to join. Barristan suggested that if Jorah was truly repentant, he might be of use in the far north, given his family ties to Bear Island. The freedmen who had survived the worst horrors in Essos also volunteered, some seeing it as a chance to prove themselves to the Westerosi who scorned them. But Daenerys frowned at the risk. This mission could turn into a suicide venture. She remembered how she had once ventured into the Red Waste with too few supplies. The Deadlands could claim them. In the swirl of planning and dread, weeks slipped by. Kevan Lannister officially bent the knee, and Daenerys accepted with careful courtesy. The crown coffers began to refill, courtesy of Tyrion's management and the Lannister gold. Freedmen started to settle in abandoned hamlets near King's Landing, planting what they could before winter's chill. All the while, the Targaryen siblings kept a wary eye on the horizon. Orien and Drogon, with Rhaegal and Viserion following, often flew scouting routes beyond the city, ensuring no Ironborn raiders approached by sea. The realm held its breath. At last, word arrived that Blackfish Tully's group had reached the wall, and what they found there defied easy explanation. Survivors from the mission recounted glimpses of undead whites attacking at night, eyes glowing with icy blue fire. They spoke of a single pale figure, tall and thin, commanding them like an army of puppets. Most harrowing, they brought back the frozen hand of a white, severed at the wrist but still twitching in a jar. On seeing it, Daenerys and Viserys felt all doubts vanish. The threat was real and it was coming. Now, the Grand Summit was no longer an abstract plan. The Targaryens needed to assemble the lords immediately. Envoys galloped across the roads, soared by ship from port to port, carrying urgent calls to gather in King's Landing before the first snows blocked the passes. Many lords grumbled, suspecting a trap or a Targaryen power play. Yet the rumors of Walking Dead, backed by the North's own nightmares, gave them pause. Slowly, begrudgingly, they began to arrive. The Tyrells of Highgarden came in a lavish caravan, newly recovered from the war. The Martells of Dorne arrived by ship, still nursing old grudges but intrigued by the notion of real danger from the far north. The Vale sent Peter Baelish as a representative, smiling, cunning, with the young Lord Robert Arryn conspicuously absent. Even the Lannisters of Casterly Rock turned up, Kevan bringing along a handful of lesser lords. None from the Iron Islands answered, as expected. Euron was rumored to be raiding near Old Town, or perhaps sailing for more distant shores with dark objectives. In the end, a remarkable assembly of noble houses gathered in Teach. Dragon Pit of King's Landing, an ancient ruin chosen because it could hold dragons and a large crowd. Daenerys and Viserys stood at the center, flanked by their dragons perched on broken arches. One by one, lords who had once warred against each other found themselves in uneasy company. Mace Tyrell eyed Kevan Lannister with suspicion. The Martell contingent watched Peter Baelish warily. Amid them all stood the Targaryen siblings, silver hair catching the light. The severed white's arm, contained in a stout iron box, quivered and scratched at the metal, a grotesque testament to the horrors beyond the wall. Daenerys spoke to them all. "This realm has warred with itself long enough. We are here to show you the truth of what lies in the north. We have a living, or rather unliving, witness." At her signal, two Unsullied lifted the iron box into the center of the dragon pit. The hush was absolute as Daenerys opened it. Out from the darkness jerked a skeletal hand, still clad in scraps of blackened flesh. It scrabbled at the air, drawing gasps and cries of alarm from the lords. Ser Barristan stepped forward and hacked at it with a sword. The thing fell still, but only after multiple blows severed it entirely. Tension crackled in the air. "This is but a fragment," Viserys said, voice echoing. "Armies of the dead are gathering beyond the wall, led by these so-called White Walkers. If we do not unite, if we do not send men north to stop them, all our crowns, all our grievances will mean nothing." Voices erupted. Tyrell bannermen demanded proof of the scope of the threat. The Martells questioned if the Whites could cross the wall. Baelish asked what advantage the Targaryens sought from this demonstration. Through it all, Daenerys and Viserys stood firm, aided by Robb Stark's own letter, read aloud by Missandei, attesting that northern scouts had confirmed the danger. Even Kevan Lannister, pale-faced, murmured that if the threat was real, House Lannister would not sit idle. Eventually, the uproar subsided enough for Daenerys to propose a plan. An armistice across Westeros, a combined force to march or sail north, reinforced by dragons, freedmen, knights, and whomever the lords could spare. The aim was to hold the wall or, if needed, fight beyond it to push back the undead. "Let us put aside our claims and vendettas," Daenerys declared, "until the realm is safe. If we fail to do so, the realm will die under an endless night." Silence followed. Then Mace Tyrell cleared his throat. "We cannot speak for every bannerman on such a matter, but the Reach will contribute supplies if the threat is truly this dire." Others chimed in similarly, offering half-pledges. Peter Baelish shrugged, smiling slyly, and said he would counsel the Vale to assist if it served the greater good. The Martells stood stony-faced, but ultimately nodded. Kevan Lannister hesitated, then said, "The Westerlands will do their duty. We will not let the dead lay claim to our lands." Relief flared in Daenerys's heart. It was the best they could have hoped for, a loose coalition of grudging partners. There would be sabotage, mistrust, rivalries. But if they could move quickly, gather men and provisions, perhaps they stood a chance. When the summit concluded, many lords departed the dragon pit with haunted looks, heading back to muster men. Daenerys and Viserys lingered among the broken pillars, the dragons overhead. With them stood a handful of close allies, Tyrion, Missandei, Barristan. The chunk of twitching white flesh still smoked where Barristan had sliced it. Viserys exhaled, feeling a strange mixture of hope and dread. "We have them for now," he said softly. "But winter is coming, and the White Walkers may not be patient." Daenerys placed a hand on Drogon's flank, the beast chuffing steam from its nostrils. "Then we march as soon as we can. Dragons will accompany the armies north. If we do not stop this threat, all our victories, all our hopes, none of it will matter." Tyrion spoke up, clearing his throat. "You realize, your graces, that this campaign will be the most perilous thing any living Targaryen has undertaken since the doom of Valyria. You will be venturing into a frozen wilderness to face an enemy that defies death itself. The realm's future rests on you two and these dragons. Are you certain you will risk everything?" Daenerys's eyes shone with firm resolve. "The realm needs us, and I will not cower in the south while the dead march on living souls." Viserys laid a hand on Orion's neck. "I once wanted a crown above all else," he said quietly. "But I have learned that kingship or queenship means serving those who cannot protect themselves. The Starks taught us that once in their own way. Now we stand on the precipice. If we do not fight for Westeros, who will?" Barristan nodded in approval. Missandei lowered her gaze, admiration visible in her eyes. Tyrion let out a soft sigh. "Very well, then we prepare. The living must unite or perish." And so began the final forging of the Targaryen siblings' destiny. Not merely as conquerors, but as protectors, rallying a fractured realm to stand against an ancient foe. In a swirl of dark wings and urgent orders, ravens flew from King's Landing to Dorne, to the Westerlands, to the Reach, to the Stormlands, to the Vale, and to the north. Soldiers began marching, ships launched, caravans of food and weapons set out on the treacherous roads. Daenerys and Viserys oversaw the mobilization of freedmen, unsullied, and knights from across the south. By their side flew Drogon and Orien, with Regal and Viserion in tow, weaving across the skies. The city's mood was tense but electrified with purpose. For once, noble and commoner alike fixed their gaze on a single cause: survival. Voices whispered in taverns that the Targaryens, united, might just be the realm's salvation. Others, more cynical, said it was all doomed to fail, that the old hatreds ran too deep, or that the undead were unstoppable. But for every cynic, there was a freedman forging a sword, a gold cloak training with renewed fervor, a peasant praying to the Seven for Daenerys and Viserys' success. The flame of hope burned, wavering yet bright, against the icy darkness creeping down from the north. On a crisp morning, near the start of what promised to be a bitter winter, Daenerys Targaryen gathered her forces outside the city walls. Armies from the Crownlands, men from the Stormlands, freedmen cavalry from Essos, and the disciplined Unsullied stood in ranks. Supply wagons rumbled behind them, loaded with grain and dragonglass weapons, mined hastily from old Valyrian caches or newly discovered veins near Dragonstone, after Tyrion's scribes uncovered references to its power against the Walkers. The mass of warriors stretched along the Rose Road, waiting for the Queen's command. In her armor of black leather and dragonscale pauldrons, Daenerys mounted Drogon. Viserys, similarly clad, swung onto Orien's back. A hush fell as the siblings rose into the sky, the beat of leathery wings sending gusts of dust across the assembled ranks. The sunlight caught on their silver-gold hair, reflecting brilliantly. Below, soldiers gazed upward, hearts pounding. It was the sight of living myth, two Targaryens on dragons, leading the largest combined host Westeros had seen in a generation. Daenerys circled once over the army, then swooped low, her voice amplified by the hush of expectation. "We ride north," she called, "for the living, for Westeros. Follow us, and we shall not falter." A roar answered her, thousands of voices raised in unison. Viserys felt Orien tremble beneath him, the dragon's mind exulting in the smell of so many men, the call of challenge ahead. Together, the Targaryen siblings turned their dragons northward. Behind them, the long columns of men, horses, and wagons began to move. It would take weeks, perhaps months, to reach the wall in full force, with the snows beginning. Yet it had begun. The realm's last, desperate gamble to unite under a banner of dragons and break the tide of darkness. Once, a young Daenerys and a cruel Viserys had been exiles, scattered and powerless. Now they rose as twin heads of the dragon, forging alliances that even old Aegon the Conqueror might have marveled at. Whether it would be enough to halt the Night's King and his host of wights remained a question for the gods. But for the first time in many lifetimes, Westeros rallied around a cause greater than ambition, life itself. And at the heart of it all, two Targaryens, once broken by fate, soared on dragon's wings toward the greatest challenge the realm had ever known.